Lord of the Mysteries, Fire of Destruction, Chapter 391 to 400. 3 p.m., Monday. In the space above the gray fog, several crimson flashes appeared on the moldy bronze table with two inhabitants, followed by various illusory and semi-transparent figures in their respective places. As was now usual, Justice rose from her seat and curtsied gracefully. In a cheerful voice, she said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Giving a simple smile, Klein nodded slightly to the woman. After the usual greetings, the Tarot Club officially began. The lady did not sit down but said, "I have brought 2 pages of the Emperor's diary, Mr. Fool. I have ready the last 8 pages I have yet to deliver." The hanged man wasted no time and quickly added, 10 pages in all. I hope there's something interesting. Surely one of them is a sexual escapade. Lamponing a bit, Klein just nodded and manifested the red fountain pen and goatskin parchment so the members could write. Before long, in his hands floated the promised pages, and he casually glanced at them. Less than greater than. The 14th of January. I discovered a problem. If unconscious high-sequence beyonder objects are not sealed, they would unconsciously attract nearby low-sequence beyonders from the same pathway, causing them to come into contact with each other. The higher the original sequence, the more likely that this will happen. However, this situation doesn't seem to be a constant. It seems to be intermittent. Less than greater than. This. Klein restrained himself from tensing up. This diary part immediately caught his attention because he had had similar encounters. As soon as Mr. Chariot arrived in Ashera, I accepted a mission that led me to meet him. Mr. Chariot, who carries an artifact made with the characteristics of Faceless. An idea was born in his mind, and he glanced sideways at the place around him. The attracting force must come from this mysterious space. Another secret of my transmigration here to see later. This page delivered by Justice lacked more data and information, so he could only turn to the last one supplied by the woman. Less than greater than. 16th January, the taste of a demoness still isn't bad. Less than greater than. Single quote ... Why am I not surprised? Klein wondered at his lack of reaction. He couldn't help but wonder if there was something wrong with him. Of course, I have already read that this guy got a divine milking from a man. The only thing that would top that would be being the passive one next. Klein lampooned a little, absent-minded and unsurprised. Thanks to Chariot's joke, Klein knew that any man who took the witch potion from sequence 7 would become a real woman. And with the escapes he had already read about from Emperor Russell, the clown felt that was enough for the man. Unable to help, he put himself in the same shoes as Emperor Russell. If my partner told me she was a witch, and I knew the possibility that she was once a he was very high, would I still have relations with her, even though she is now a real woman? Would I take that step and not be repulsed by the idea? Klein lampooned for a few moments before coming up with an answer that defended him. No, he doubted he would be able to do it. The knowledge would be too much for him, and Minnie Klein could not be proud. Maybe there were beautiful witches out there who would fight against that knowledge, but the lack of proof helped calm the clown. After all, he had never met a real witch. The closest thing to his mind when he thought of a witch was Madame Daly Simone, a woman of great beauty and a flirtatious yet gracious character. Putting aside that existential doubt, Klein continued reading the last page delivered by Justice. Less than greater than. The 20th of January, I finished making the second card of blasphemy. Let me think, where should I hide it? Yes, I plan to disguise it as a bookmark and insert it into a very valuable book. If the person who obtains it isn't someone fated, it would be hard to imagine that the most valuable thing in the book is actually that seemingly ordinary bookmark. Not bad, that's a good idea. Less than greater than. Why do I always have to be provoked by my elders? It's not only with Mr. Chariot, but now it's you, Emperor. Why didn't you put what kind of bookmark? In what book did you put it? You dared to dream me up and then kill me coldly. You have no heart. Klein felt his blood heat up and his brow quiver for the briefest of moments. The Emperor had disappointed him twice in a row this day. Perhaps future diary entries will have more information on this. Saving this hint for later, the clown finally moved his attention to the pack of pages delivered by the hanged man. Less than greater than. April 5th. Mistress Not So Straight as A Board, or as she prefers me to call her, Mistress Amelie, has come to congratulate me on my future marriage to Lady Matilda. She brought me a chocolate cake, which, by the way, was delicious. And she also brought a new costume and whip, which she wore that very night while we were eating the cake. Usually, she would leave shortly after, leaving me with the marks of our games and adventures, but this time, she stayed a little longer. She fed me what survived of the cake, and we even took a bath together, her rubbing all the marks she left on my body. Was that the popular aftercare? It felt good. Of course, that aftercare didn't last long, eventually revealing what I suspected. She wanted something. You let me stick a finger in there, you can stick it there. She said to me, wearing something that looked like something out of a sex fiend. Ads by PubFuture. If you've read my diary, this isn't the first time she's played there. Several times, she's tempted me, and even on a drunken night, I let her eat it. Less than greater than. For a moment, Klein closed his eyes, almost putting his face in his hands and cried. Only his brutal endurance saved him from doing that in his clown control. I didn't even finish the first page. Wailing in horror, the clown made the gray fog over his face denser and continued reading. Less than greater than. Of course, when I woke up the next day, I was furious and almost lashed out at her. How dare she destroy my masculinity like that? All she said to me was, I didn't hear you complaining about my tongue, Russell. Is this how people feel powerless before a superior being? Because no matter how hard I looked, I found no way to take it back. I was pretty vocal, in fact. Whatever. The deal she gave me was very juicy, and after deliberate and deep consideration, I accepted it. You will understand if you see the ass that woman carries. If I must take a finger up there to taste it, so be it. Only real men do that. I plan to meet her next week. At her recommendation and out of concern for myself, I'm bringing extra lubricant. April 12th. I'm writing this as soon as we finish the deal. It didn't feel bad at all, I would even recommend it. Mind you, next time, I have to specify only one finger. The bitch used 3. She still has my palm mark on her cheek, but it doesn't seem to bother her. She even tells me to be just as violent next time. Intis women are scary. I'm going to pray to the god of craftsmanship that Matilda will be gentler. Less than greater than. If he had the original page in his hands, Klein would burn it with holy fire. Wishing with all his might that he could forget this, he turned to the next page. The dates are different. Frowning slightly, he gave a little more attention. Less than greater than. June 15th. This is the 5th week of travel in search of the new continent. Normally I wouldn't write this early, but today we came across something extremely interesting. There wasn't much wind, so some of our seafarers and windlass decided to have a little swim. It's nothing strange, we already know how much those gill-less fish love the water. The depth those guys can reach still amazes me. Well, it turns out that one of those seafarers found the remains of a sunken ship. We've dropped anchor and are now in the process of salvaging whatever managed to survive. A little spoiler. From its looks, it's a 4th epic ship. We have not yet found a mark of the family it belonged to, but by size, it is likely to have been one of the various angel families of the epic. But which one is the question? Will it be during the Solomon Empire, the Tudor Trunsoest Empire, or perhaps the separation of the aforementioned? What a thrill. I'm sure it will be full of treasures. I'll write more tomorrow. June 16th. As always, the protagonist of this era turns out to be right. We have found the Tudor family seal on it. From what I could see, this ship was very likely made during the Tudor Empire. The coins we found there show the seals of the 5 angel families that supported it. This is quite interesting. Unfortunately, all that was there were old notebooks ruined by time and sea and a few treasures. We also found more ships in the vicinity, but due to a lack of time and worsening weather, we could only grab the most interesting and continue the trip. How can I be so unlucky? I checked every artifact that was brought for abnormalities or specialties but found nothing. Ads by PubFuture. I'm not interested in carrying useless junk, so I told the crew to grab what they wanted and throw the rest. This was a waste of time. June 21st. Something strange has been going on with some of the crew members. They claim to hear voices and see things in the shadows. One even attacked another crew member because he thought he was a monster. These same people were acting completely normal a few days ago. Being a genius, I immediately noticed the cause of this. I ordered everyone to hand over everything they had grabbed from the treasures of the fourth epic ship. Some resisted a bit, but in the end, they were all confiscated. I went through each and every one of them again. But again, I found nothing unusual. Is it possible that this is some sort of corruption? Did one of these objects belong to a high-level Beander and be marked by their aura, affecting and causing strange reactions thousands of years later? With the possibility of that being the case, I immediately ordered everything to be thrown overboard. We did not have the resources or means to deal with something of such level and being so far from land. The best thing to do was to avoid accidents. The people who showed changes have been removed and quarantined. We will be monitoring them these days to see if they improve. June 30th. It seems that whatever was affecting the auditory and visual visions went to the bottom of the sea. The people in quarantine have shown improvement. This was merely an oversight on my part. I underestimated the danger of certain things, but nothing escalated further. July 1st. We have lost 5 men. Not all the artifacts were thrown into the sea. One of the normal people hid a mirror he had taken from the treasures. The bastard hid it in his room, and who knows what he did with it. This person, who was not a Beander, had neither extraordinary abilities nor basic mystical knowledge. This ordinary person was suddenly able to sing melodies that bristled and froze the spirit and launched attacks through music. He produced symphonies that increased or decreased the area's spirituality in meaningful measures. Even summoning a rather strong evil spirit wasn't much of a problem. Luckily, we had several sun pathway artifacts. This person I had previously shared drinks and food with was a man searching for adventure like myself. He became a complete stranger. No matter how I looked, I didn't recognize him. Now, his body was covered with strange marks and lumps of flesh that released music. He used his hair like guitar strings and his thighs like drums. We managed to subdue and kill him. But when we blew his head and torso off with the combined attack of a wind blessed and a sun pathway artifact, instead of blood and brains, shards of glass came out. His body had become a huge crystal, and the mirror in the middle of it all reflected a space filled with a strange gray mist. I checked this object multiple times but found nothing strange. Now, this once normal object emitted a dark and oppressive aura that took my breath away. Before I could do anything about it, this mirror shattered into multiple pieces, but not before I saw my reflection in it, a reflection that was me, but my eyes were crimson in it. All that gloomy aura vanished as if it had never been there. What the fuck was that mirror? What the fuck were those ships carrying? And more importantly, who the fuck did that mirror belong to? It has been precisely 6 hours since the monster died. No characteristics or artifacts have formed. No matter what artifacts we use to speed up the process, the body isn't releasing anything. The remains of the mirror, along with the entire ship and everyone on it, were treated by various purification rituals, and the quarantine of the people affected by the ship's objects was reinstated. Everyone is tense and wants to return. I hope to find something of real value soon, or all my efforts will have been for nothing. Less than greater than. Klein internally swallowed a little saliva. What he just read could easily be considered an adventure movie that quickly descended into a horror one. It seems that the Emperor's journey in discovering the South Continent did not go smoothly. From the dates this event was 1 month before discovering the continent. How he maintained morale in that situation is beyond me. Praising the Emperor's ability to lead, Klein felt his respect for the man increase slightly. The events written in this diary were not in the history books. This event was hidden. Manipulation of history. Recalling the words written by the Emperor not long ago, Klein saw another clear example of them. The abilities of the monster the man had also faced were things he had never heard of. A monster that attacks using music and whose own body is an instrument. That was something he had not thought he would read. But I don't know of any pathway with those abilities. Is it even one of the 22? Or is it a new one? Was a new pathway even possible? Wouldn't it contradict everything he knew so far? I can't help but notice that too. Angel families. I wonder if the Abraham family was one of them. Internally shaking his head, Klein made the pages disappear. This wasn't something he needed to worry about now. With that in mind, he smiled calmly at the rest. You may begin. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Seeing his office's familiar door and wall, the black-haired man throned his neck and stretched in his chair. Several satisfying cracks crawled up his back. "Ah, I needed that," Adrian moaned in pleasure as he relaxed in his chair. "If you keep making those sounds, the idea that I'm just a guard won't work," Flora complained with 2 fingers on the bridge of her nose, her white hair still tied back in the same ponytail. "This guy certainly is a handful." The looks she got from the workers still made her click her tongue in annoyance. She was wearing one of the many dresses she bought over the weekend, a beautiful, polished, thick black dress with leaf and copper detailing along the edges of the long skirt, which formed patterns of branches. Because of the cold that autumn brought, her hands were covered by beautiful white gloves. "Let them think what they want." The black-haired man rolled his shoulders disinterestedly as he grabbed his cup of coffee. While it had grown cold, a simple hot breath solved the problem. With a cup of hot coffee in hand, the man looked at the woman with a small smile. "Have you thought about what I said?" Adrian asked as he took a light sip from his cup. "I'll do a little test. If you do something useful with it, the others will soon follow." Flora replied calmly, her gaze passing boredly around the office. One of the multiple companies she controlled from the shadows would make a small investment in her companions. Of course, it would be one of the minor ones, one that she didn't care if she lost or made a profit. "That's more than enough for me." With a victorious chuckle, the man looked at his cup for a few moments before extending it to the woman. "Would you like some?" Without answering, Flora looked up at him from her spot and extended her hand by twisting her wrist a bit. The next moment, Adrian watched rather interested as the cup disappeared from his hand and reappeared in Flora's, who was quick to start drinking. "If I wasn't watching it disappear, I wouldn't have even realized it was stolen." Truly, the powers of that pathway give a lot for mischief. In a way, Adrian could understand why a certain raven enjoyed being a troll so much. It was too tempting. He didn't even notice the weight change when the cup disappeared. "You drink a lot of coffee." Raising an eyebrow, Adrian looked curiously at his guard. "Is there something wrong with that?" "I just like it." Now that he was the conspirator of Sequence 6, the caffeine in a simple cup of coffee no longer affected him, so he simply consumed it for the taste. Flora lowered the cup and looked at him. "Just one thing I noticed. That and your disdain for tea." For as long as she had known him, she had never seen him drink tea. Not a single bag or leaf was in their home, and the ones that were there, he threw in the trash. The expensive tea equipment in the room was practically gathering dust. "I don't like it." Adrian rolled his shoulders disinterestedly before smiling flirtatiously. "Why the sudden curiosity? Trying to make an anti-me repellent? Would it work?" Flora arched an eyebrow slightly, her eyes sparkling with amusement. The red-haired man winked. "Maybe if you were the tea, I wouldn't have so much trouble trying it." "And there it is." Shaking her head with her cheeks somewhat hot, the Jacob lamented a little. It still grabbed her good, even if she was ready for what was coming. Sometimes, she thought he was from Intis and not Fasak because of how flirtatious he usually was, and his methods were more Intesian-like. If it weren't for the time she was in his body, she'd think the guy was dirtier than the streets of East Borough. As long as she'd known him, the guy hadn't tried to dance his way into a lady. He could tempt them but never go dancing. The closest he ever got was with her in the tower. Sighing somewhat already accustomed to the man's flirtatious attitude and ignoring her warm ears, she continued, "With how varied your palate is, one wouldn't think there's anything you don't like to eat or drink." "There are several things I don't like to eat," Adrian admitted honestly. "Believe it or not, I can't stand the taste of cauliflower, let alone tripe." The man finished with a visible grimace of disgust and shudder. He could still remember the day his uncle had made him taste that sin of food. Never again. "How old are you?" 10. Taken a little by surprise, the woman looked a little incredulously at the man. "First, I don't like the taste of cauliflower. Second, I hate the towel texture of tripe." The distaste on the man's face was evident, and Flora laughed in amusement. Rolling his eyes, the black-haired man leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. "Wake me up if someone's coming." "Yes, yes, yes, princess." Smiling mischievously, Flora took another sip of her coffee and laughed silently. Who would have thought it? There's one thing on this earth that a Phaeacian wouldn't eat. Ignoring Flora's clear amusement, Adrian began to draw the white sphere in his mind. A moment ago, Whispers had reached his ears. Miss Ryder asks for her allowance. A few hours later, Monday night, holding the purple-covered book in his left hand, the red-haired man controlled some of the power of the City of Calamities, and a large mirror formed in front of him. It was full length, made entirely of what appeared to be silver. He had already read the entire book and was ready to begin experimenting with mirror divination. Adrian let out a soft sigh. The redhead raised his hand, and an object in the distance flew into his hand. This was a simple towel. It was clearly once white but was now stained dark brown from dried blood. Adrian stared with expressionless eyes at this handkerchief, his gaze void of emotion. The blood that had soiled the clean handkerchief was that of someone he considered a friend but who turned out to be just a traitor waiting for the moment to kill him. He thought he would feel more upset or even a little sad to touch this again, but he surprised himself when all he felt was great apathy. That surprise lasted a few moments before a soft chuckle came from him. I was never one to dwell on the past. What happened, happened. All that's left is to move forward. Lifting the soiled towel to the mirror, Adrian muttered in ancient Hermes as he rubbed the mirror's surface with it, starting at the edges, forming various patterns and symbols. The potion formula of assassin. The potion formula of assassin. After repeating the sentence 2 times, the brown color of the towel turned to dark red. Crimson hot liquid began to drip, but the redhead ignored that and continued tracing the symbols. The potion formula of assassin. The potion formula of assassin. The yellowish smoke around him began to move smoothly around him, without any rush, slowly entering the mirror, whose reflective surface began to become turbulent. At that precise moment, when the mirror's surface began to become turbulent and what it reflected was undistinguishable, the last symbol was drawn in fresh blood in the middle of it. It was a spear, with infinity enveloping it and with an open book at its feet. Ads by PubFuture. As soon as the symbol was painted, the mirror's surface became murky and dark, as if it had suddenly become a window to the bottom of the ocean. Amidst that turbulence and darkness, a scene slowly began to form. It was a simple study, with a bookshelf full of books on the wall, a medium-sized desk on one side, and what stood out the most was the large mirror in one corner. 2 people were in the study, a fine-featured man with short blonde hair and a beautiful brown-haired woman. The red-haired man's brow furrowed slightly. He recognized Robert but not the woman who, from their somewhat similar features, appeared to be siblings or, at the very least, family. A sister or cousin, but immediate family. As he thought the scene continued, the strange but familiar woman smiled at Robert and held out a piece of paper. The man took it with trembling hands. Tears fell from his eyes. Will I ever see you again? A soft laugh came from the woman who gave a gentle nod. Even that small gesture had a certain beauty in it. When you become a real woman, that's the day we'll be sisters again. The woman responded with an elegant smile, her brown eyes shining warmly. Then, she blinked, and the warmth was replaced by cold indifference. Until then. With those final words, the woman walked to the mirror and took a step. Instead of breaking, the mirror's surface shook like a disturbed river, and the woman stepped into it and disappeared from the room. After a few moments, the mirror's surface regained its shape and reflected the man's crying face. Robert shivered slightly before nodding vigorously. See you soon, Sister Sharon. May the primordial protect you. He then opened the paper and read what was written on it. Less than greater than. Assassin's formula. Main ingredients. 5 feathers of sinew and 50 grams of cursed earth. Supplementary ingredients. 100 milliliters of purified water, cannibal snakeskin, 5 drops of intis blueberry juice, a pure silver dagger, and 15 milliliters of lead. Instigator formula. Main ingredients. A demon throat honeyguide's heart, a dark prowler's poison sac. Supplemental ingredients. Witch's formula. Main ingredients. Every drop of an abyss demonic fish blood, an agate peacock egg. Supplemental ingredients. Less than greater than. At the scene, Robert reread the paper several times before holding it up to the lamp in the room and burning it. As soon as that happened, the turbulence returned, and Adrian saw himself reflected. His reflection showed a thoughtful expression. Since the woman appeared, he felt a strange sense of familiarity. He somehow knew her but was sure he had never seen her. Robert had said his family was in Tingen. Adrian mumbled with a hand on his chin. While clearly, the information the man had told him clearly could be a lie, but the redhead didn't dismiss it. A conspirator could not ignore information. It only took a few moments for the answer to the strange familiarity he felt with the woman to be resolved. After all, as far as he knew, there was only one witch in Tingen. With a loud grunt, Adrian slapped his face in exasperation. I killed Sharon's little brother. How bad was his luck? Sighing a little, the redhead rolled his shoulders disinterestedly, and his hands burst into flames, burning the towel to ashes. Well, never mind. Klein should have dealt with her by now. I don't have to. In the middle of his words, Adrian stopped like a train hitting the brakes. Quote. After a few seconds of awkward silence, he nodded slowly. Almost. Never tempt fate, she's a bad-tempered woman. Quote. Next time I see him, I'll ask him about it. Mumbling a little, the redhead reached out his hand to the side. From the haze of yellowish smoke, an object shot out towards him. On its way several crimson droplets disappeared into the yellowish ground. A few meters from reaching him, the object stopped in midair. It was a beautiful S-shaped dagger, dark black in color. Its blade released thick drops of blood that did not seem to stop, and its handle was orange with fine slashes all over it. 2-48 blood dagger. The artifact made with the characteristics of Reaper. Before, Adrian planned to wait for Nathan to return to use his divination to get the Reaper's potion formula after fragmenting the artifact and recovering its characteristics, but now it wasn't necessary. After using Robert's blood for a test, Adrian considered himself ready to obtain his formula using the artifact as a medium. Mirror divination is similar to pendulum divination and dream divination. To perform mirror divination, you must repeat a prayer about what you seek to obtain several times in powerful language and perform certain steps. Although mirror divination does not require using cogitation to enter a trance, unlike those divinations, it is even recommended not to do so. The state of calm and trance that it brought could cause accidents. That state could make one look beyond what one should or do things that would jeopardize the outcome of the divination. Another difference of mirror divination is that it does not use the astral body to receive revelations through the spiritual world. This is for obvious reasons, one of which is that the mirror world is its own dimension completely unrelated to the spirit world. To perform mirror divination, one must use the corresponding symbols and ingredients. Each symbol was a letter that formed a sentence, and to put the final point to that sentence, one had to place the symbol of the primordial demoness. For obvious reasons, the redhead used his symbol as the Scarlet Monarch instead. The ingredients could vary a lot, depending on what you wanted to achieve and how. If you wanted to divine over someone or something specific, the best way was to use that person's blood. What followed the blood was hair, pieces of skin, and nails. It didn't matter if the blood had dried, as long as it was enough, the mirror divination process would make it liquid. Once all that is done, you can perform mirror divination. Extending his right hand and letting blood daggers falling blood wash over it, Adrian began to trace various symbols in the mirror with the blood while repeating in ancient Hermes. The potion formula of Reaper. The potion formula of Reaper. As the mirror's surface began to become turbulent and what it reflected was indistinguishable, he traced the symbol of the Scarlet Monarch. The murky, dark surface returned but was soon slowly replaced. The red-haired man's eyebrows raised slightly before the scene was fully charged, and a quiet, elegant melody emanated from the mirror. Music. Adrian whispered a little confused before the scene in the mirror manifested itself. Ads by PubFuture. It was a beautiful, luxurious room. The fine, detailed linens, along with the purple curtains, gave it a regal air. In the detailed chair of that luxurious study was a man about 30 years old, with short reddish-black hair cut in a military style. His eyes were a deep iron black color, and hot air surrounded him. Behind him, a large shield almost covered the entire wall. It was the figure of a man in armor, carrying a spear in his hand, pointing to the ground. In front of this man was another, much younger. He was in his mid-20s with medium-length red hair. His eyes were blue, and his posture was incredibly straight. A bead of sweat trickled down his brow, which was slightly furrowed in discomfort. Your contributions in the battles have been notorious, Asur. I have not ceased to hear praise for you at the celebrations. Your words praise me, uncle. It is always an honor to serve the family. Asur smiled, but his lips trembled. Uncle at that just guffawed and shook his head. I have things to do, so I will not be able to assist you with this. That will be entirely in your hands. Shouldn't be a problem, right? No, uncle, never. Asur shook his head, the discomfort seemed to have left him, and now there was great excitement in his eyes. The older man made a disinterested, as he pulled a letter sealed with the same crest from a drawer in his desk behind him and extended it to the young man in front of him. Try to memorize it. Once you open it, it will be destroyed. The hand that grasped the letter didn't even flinch at that. The young man just nodded and opened the letter without hesitation. Less than greater than. Reaper's formula. Main ingredients. Gray demonic wolf's front claws and the forest hunter's tongue. Supplementary ingredients. 80 milliliters of gray demonic wolf's blood, 2 fangs of the forest hunter, 10 drops of colorful bearded horned lizard venom, 10 drops of hornbeam essential oils. Ritual. Plan and execute a successful capture of a target with a sequence higher than your own. Flaunt the completed conspiracy before them and consume the potion as they witness your victory, filled with fear and despair. Less than greater than. A team of punishers have taken to patrolling the coasts west of the island. An ocean songster is their captain. You shouldn't have any trouble dealing with him, should you? Asur smiled and nodded, of course. The man's voice went from being heard clearly to just gurgling, his clear image fading into the turbulent surface. The mirror's surface trembled again and now only reflected Adrian's figure. Adrian smiled hugely at his reflection. He recognized the shield that appeared in the mirror very well. Why, every good Faesac, whether rich or poor, would recognize it. The coat of arms of the imperial family of Faesac, Ernhan. So you're made of royal blood, eh? The red-haired man looked at the floating dagger at his side and laughed in amusement. If he used the characteristics of this dagger, wouldn't that make him royalty by inheritance? Shaking his head at how horrible that idea sounded to him, Adrian controlled the smoke so that it cleared his hand. Done so, he returned to touching the dripping blood and retraced several symbols. Unlike before, these were not so complicated, yet they radiated a great amount of mysticism. While your sealing method is easy for someone like me, it's a huge waste. At least it seems that creativity is not lacking in the church. Clicking his tongue with some annoyance, Adrian began to mutter in ancient Hermes. The blood of the dagger will work as a substitute. The blood of the dagger will work as a substitute. Finishing reciting the prayer 5 times, Adrian drew the symbol of the Scarlet Monarch. The mirror's surface showed no change for a few moments before its calmness broke for a second before returning to normal. The sight was very similar to a drop falling into still water. A sigh full of joy came from the redhead. Positive. If the surface was broken like this, it meant a positive result, but if it remained unchanged and the reflection spilled the blood of the symbols, it was a negative result. Well, at least that makes it easier to get the supplementary ingredients. Laughing a little, Adrian patted the handle of the dagger playfully. To your corner you return, O imperial child. The dagger vibrated for a moment, not seeming to like the nickname, but the man ignored it and waved his hand disinterestedly. The dagger shot towards his designated punishment zone, but a few feet in, Adrian snapped his fingers. Fush! The dagger ignited in orange flames, which grew in magnitude as it touched the dripping blood from the black blade. While he wanted to accumulate the blood to use as a future explosive, it was not possible to do that. When he received the artifact, he also received a copy of all the experiments they did with it. It didn't matter where it went. If the amount of blood the blood dagger released was equal to the amount in a 6-inch puddle, it didn't matter if he separated them into containers, the dagger would still go into a frenzy. It also didn't work to trigger a frenzy and kill the owner to keep the previous puddle. It would just burst into flames on its own and disappear soon after. Sealing the blood dagger was quite simple. Set it on an intense fire and let the blood feed the flames. Watching the dagger burn silently, Adrian couldn't help but find it poetic. Hunters must bathe in blood, flames, and destruction to grow. Without conflict, we would be stagnant. And those who do not seek conflict are not saved, for they will be used to climb to the throne of the one who reigns over war. Mumbling thoughtfully, the redhead paused for a moment before laughing softly. We are born of blood, we become men by blood, and we die by blood. Shaking his head, Adrian closed his eyes and, after a moment, left the City of Calamities. Victoria Road, Wayne Enterprises. Eleanor, dressed in a thick shirt and vest, hair always neatly slicked back, stood in front of his boss's desk with a somewhat confused expression. Wouldn't it be better to have a postman deliver this, Mr. Wayne? In his hands was a sealed envelope of good size and a little heavy for some simple papers. His boss, who had a small smile, shook his head. That envelope contains important information. I can't rely on the care of a postman to deliver it in order. And why do I have to be the one to do it? Wouldn't it be better if Miss I'll never remember your name did it? The man swallowed the question and bowed respectfully to his boss. Turning slightly, he gave a subtle nod to the woman beside his boss, who just gave him a bored look. What a serious guard. After checking the address and confirming the unit number, Eleanor left the office. Waiting a few moments and making sure they were alone, Flora turned to look at the man in the chair curiously. You only saw him last week and you're already getting back in touch. I knew he was special, but to this extent, you must hold him in high esteem. The princess revealed himself as soon as he found a moment to do so. It was obvious that this detective must be special. But it was at this moment that Flora realized that she had perhaps underestimated this specialty a little. Looking at his companion with one eye closed, Adrian chuckled softly. In a way, we're old friends who haven't seen each other in a long time. A white eyebrow rose. Oh, not in that way, Adrian added boredly, his eyes saying, really? Flora threw up her hands in mocking surrender and laughed in amusement. Her eyes also sparkled mischievously now. Why the need to defend yourself? I didn't say anything. Adrian snapped his fingers and pointed at her, looking at her in amazement. You got me there. The Jacob smiled sideways. Of course I did. After a moment of enjoying her grandiose victory, she added, by the way, why don't you just send it like you normally do? The problem was too simple, and the solution was even simpler, so much so that there shouldn't be one. If security were a serious problem, the messenger would solve it immediately. Who would dare mess with an angel? Adrian gave a mysterious smile, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. It's not time for that yet. Again, he was full of shit. It was more for the safety of the poor god than anything else. A door pathway angel, mixed or not, would undoubtedly find what he had very juicy. The attraction of their path will lead her to Wach, and there's not much you can hide from a planeswalker. The black-haired man rolled his shoulders inwardly in a bit of irony. And it's not as if Klein could hide it from her. Sephira Castle's aura was seeping continuously, something that wouldn't be fixed until Klein became a bizarro sorcerer, making the situation even more dangerous. While Chicho now called him Lord, to Adrian that was less than an empty title. He had no control over her. It was best to avoid accidents until he was sure that her loyalty lay with him. Besides, it wasn't as if the information in the letter was sensitive. Foo-foo. It's just an opportunity and an invitation to a dance. What else is there? The man laughed a little, got up, and walked over to a small table to his right. He was in the mood for a good cup of coffee. Using the coffee pot he had installed in his office a few days ago, Adrian calmly watched as his cup was filled, the soft smell of freshly brewed beans soothing his mind. Of course, it's not just Klein who's in danger. Chicho could also be in danger if she were to meet the bearer of Sephira Castle. In her current state, their meeting could cause trouble for both sides. The mere thought that such trouble could happen made cold sweat run down his back. Sighing slightly, he grabbed one of the two steaming mugs, but before he could reach for the other, it disappeared. Really? Adrian looked at his guard, who suddenly had her eyes closed and her lips slightly parted. I don't want my peace disturbed. Shoo, stay in your corner. Flora opened one eye in amusement and continued gazing out the window at the blue sky, taking an extremely satisfied sip of the steaming cup in her hand. Glancing down at his companion's back and then at her hair, Adrian wondered if he should heed the voice calling him to bring some fire closer to the cotton cloud. After a brief but intense internal struggle, the dark-haired man shrugged. Nah, it's too beautiful for that. With the decision made, Adrian sat down and took a light sip of his coffee as he considered his new business idea. Miss Vivian will have to look into it, and I will have to talk to some experts, but it shouldn't be a problem. With everything coming up, this will come in handy soon. With the corners of his lips raised, the man closed his notebook and concentrated on drinking his coffee. Ads by PubFuture. He had a lot to consider in the future, in much less time than he would have liked to do them. So, in the really short time he could relax, Adrian made sure to enjoy them. Pitado Street, Unit 6-3. After finishing breakfast, Klein prepared for another day of waiting at home. As he waited, someone knocked on the door. As he walked towards it, wondering what the job might be this time, the image of the person behind it formed in his mind, and his pace stopped momentarily. It was a young man with slicked back hair and a deep gaze. Klein recognized him as one of Chariot's workers. Sensing that this could be important, Klein wasted no time and opened the door with a small smile. "Good morning, Mr. Eleanor. I didn't think we'd see each other again so soon." The man's calm expression broke slightly. His eyebrows raised slightly, and his eyes sparkled with recognition. "Good morning to you, too, Detective. I didn't think you'd remember me. The last time we saw each other, our interaction was rather brief." Though a little taken aback by the reaction, Klein didn't question it, just gave a graceful nod and smiled mysteriously. "I'm a detective. Remembering faces and names is something that comes naturally." Eleanor smiled brightly for a moment, his eyes sparkling even more, before he sighed frustratedly and whispered, "I wish there were more people like you, Mr. Moriarty." "And what's wrong with this one?" Controlling his face to keep his smile in place, Klein turned slightly away from the door. "Would you like to come in so we can talk more comfortably?" Anything to do with that man was best discussed in a more private place. Not in the middle of the corridor. Returning to his professionalism, Eleanor coughed slightly and nodded, "If it's not too much trouble." They sat in the living room, now officially Klein's office, holding a cup of freshly brewed tea in each hand. "Normally I would only offer water, but I have to treat Mr. Chariot's men well. Besides, this tea is not very expensive, a 12-pack of bags costs 8 cuprums. Even though it was cheap, it was quite rich and sweet. Just because it was cheap, it didn't have to taste bad." Eleanor was the first to start the conversation by putting his cup down slightly. "Again, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Moriarty. I'm here on an errand from my boss, Mr. Harvey Wayne. I'm sure you remember him." "Yes, I do remember." Smiling slightly, the detective nodded, "Of course I do. If it hadn't been for Mr. Wayne's help, my job would have been a lot harder. We detectives aren't exactly popular. A helping hand is always appreciated." Eleanor nodded back, "He's a kind man. There's no doubt about that." Klein didn't comment, he just smiled, holding back the trembling of his lips. After a few short pleasantries, Eleanor finally told the reason for his visit. "Mr. Wayne instructed me to come in person to deliver a personal commission from him to you. I don't know the reasons nor what it is, he only gave me instructions to deliver the information to you once you've accepted it." "A personal mission from Mr. Chariot. Is there anything special about this mission? An ulterior motive? Another problem with an evil god I have to deal with?" All sorts of possibilities flashed through his mind, each weighing heavier on his being and bringing up recent bad memories. Fighting the urge to bite the inside of his cheek, the detective gave a simple nod to get up from his seat. "Excuse me, but I haven't had time to go to the bathroom yet. Could you give me a moment?" Klein said apologetically. "Ah, yes, of course." Eleanor just nodded, a little taken aback but not noticing anything unusual. Klein smiled at the man and returned to his more traveled room, the corners of his lips quivering slightly. This was becoming so commonplace that he was losing his embarrassment. As he locked the door, a heavy sigh left his being. Taking off his glasses, he rubbed his forehead briefly before looking at his reflection in the mirror. In the time he had been in Ashera as a mere detective, he had solved a few cases. None that involved anything serious or very dangerous, they could even be considered more mundane. Investigating whether a husband had been unfaithful to his wife. If there was a lover in the place where his wife worked. Or his favorite and strangest, the search for a child's pet, a black cat called Dolly. But despite the variety and frequency of the jobs, Klein knew he was still far from the money he needed to buy the ingredients to become a magician. The rate at which he was solving cases was barely enough to pay the rent on his house and his food and expenses for the month, let alone the question of his ingredients. It would take him months to save up enough to buy his ingredients. And at the rate the tarot club is growing, I don't have much time. Calmly, the detective pulled a simple coin from his pocket, a cuprum. Although he knew anything to do with chariot and divination would be bugged, Klein still had to try. Not trying to prove if it was safe was against his acting as a seer. A simple divination would be more than enough. I should take this job. I should take this job. Repeating 7 times in his mind, he tossed the coin into the air, which spun several times. He opened his palm to receive it, and the coin fell but went through the man's fingers and hit the wooden floor with a silent thud. Failure. Klein was not depressed by the result, it was something he was looking forward to. As he left the bathroom and returned to his guest, the detective said, "I'll take your boss's case." Maintaining his professionalism, Eleanor nodded and pulled a thick envelope from his vest. "Mr. Wayne told me to give you this if you agreed. Read it, everything you need to investigate is in." With that, the man pulled out a few bills. "This is payment for your time. Thank you for seeing me, Detective Moriarty. May knowledge be with you." Ads by PubFuture. Klein smiled, took the money, and after counting to make sure it was complete, returned his attention to the man and gave a slight nod. "May knowledge be with you as well, Mr. Eleanor." The clown returned to the bathroom after dismissing the man from his living room mystery office. Locking the door and forming a wall of spirituality, and after a brief divination about the safety of opening the letter, which again failed, the man opened the envelope. Inside was another smaller envelope, a letter, and a thick wad of bills. The second thing he noticed was the neatness of the handwriting, followed by the red color of the ink. Less than greater than. "Greetings, Detective. I have a little job for you. Don't worry, for someone with your skills I doubt it will be difficult for you to complete it." "Well, I'll get straight to the point, I don't want to waste your precious time. I was hoping you could investigate the whereabouts of the former owner of my beloved firm, Dieter Smykt, and the former receptionist, Mr. William. In the small envelope that came with this letter, you will find some of their belongings and some information about them on the back of this letter. This should be enough for you to start investigating. Honestly, this is more of a confirmation for me than a necessity. There is probably a gang involved, it should be a normal one. At most, they might have a few low sequence beyonders. Considering that I've heard nothing from above, they're few and far between and have a profile that's not interesting at all. I just want you to see how they behave and what they have done. Since I bought the guy's company, he's been pretty quiet, and as the current owner, I can't help but worry about the underdog. You know what I mean, right? Well, I don't have a lot of demands on this, to be honest. Just confirmation of his status. Just to emphasize, don't put yourself at risk for these guys. I couldn't care less about their lives, so if they end up dumped in the sewers, it's not my problem. But yours, oh, Detective, your life is very important to me. I've left the first payment for this job in the envelope. It's 1/3 of what I plan to give you if you can complete it, so consider it an incentive. By the way, there is a Beander party on the 7th of September. If you want, I can take you there. What do you think? I'll wait for your answer until Wednesday, please don't be late." That would be all, so, catch them if you can, Mr. Moriarty. Less than greater than. This has to be a reference of some kind. The clown looked at the last line with mixed feelings, confusion at the strangeness and some embarrassment at the way it was written. Compared to the rest of the letter, the last line had been written with much more delicacy and grace. He was even inclined to say it had a bit of flirtatiousness. Unconsciously, he wiped the palms of his hands with a nearby towel, which were covered in sweat from the letter. Why did Chariot decide to use one of his men to deliver the letter instead of his messenger? As far as I know, his messenger is extremely fast. Klein was confused, this detail didn't make much sense to him. Was there a reason for his decision? Sure, it's not like this job contains sensitive information or anything. Besides, if someone else got hold of this letter and reported it as suspicious activity, what would happen? It's the police reporting the police. Klein frowned a little and could only take his mind off the subject momentarily. Gathering. Thinking about the invitation, it didn't take the clown long to decide. This guy is going with me. What have I got to fear? If there were any problems, he was sure that Chariot would solve them with ease. Turning his attention back to the work at hand, Klein looked over the materials provided. The smaller envelope contained some fountain pens and a small notebook. The wad of bills contained 100 sasam. But how much money does this guy have? Ignoring his grin, the detective put the money away. If this is the first payment for the job, then the final payment will be 300 sasam. Feeling his cheeks ache, the clown patted the money a little, extremely happy. Then, an idea struck him, and he returned to reading the letter. A possibility formed in his mind, and the man couldn't help but feel hopeful. Not long ago, Chariot bought his company from this guy. That means he has deep pockets at the moment. Controlling his excitement, the man sighed softly and gave a slow nod. If the target turns out to be a bad person, and if stealing from him doesn't turn out to be dangerous, Klein is willing to take the risk. I hope he's a bastard, then I won't feel bad when I bleed him dry. He would never steal from an innocent, it was against his nature. He had to have a line that was not to be crossed. That was his line. Never hurt the innocent. Patting his pocket once more and with the evidence dealt with, he finally grabbed the documents relating to his two targets. The motivation to complete this case burned brightly in his chest. The names of his targets shone golden like treasure. William Cartwright and Dieter Smykt. Sitting on the toilet, Klein tapped his chin curiously as he went over the information. The previous owner and his receptionist. Possible gang involvement, money to pay off a debt. As he reviewed the data, the man looked at the pens and small notebook that came with the letter. The notebook turned out to be an old notepad containing miscellaneous information about jobs and deals that went nowhere or failed, as well as the names of the people they visited, the dates they visited, and the times they stayed. The pens showed signs of use and were almost out of ink. Each handle bore a long S. These were the personal belongings of his targets, items that had been in contact with them for a long time and had left their mark on them. Mr. Chariot is very familiar with my path. Everything he could possibly need to conduct a thorough and straightforward investigation was handed to him on a silver platter. Klein wasn't surprised, to be honest. It made sense. After all, the god behind Chariot seemed to know a lot about the seer pathway. Shaking his head, Klein placed the things Mr. Chariot had delivered to him on top of the sink, opened a drawer, and took out the materials needed to perform the sacrificial ritual. The materials he used to make the altars were similar to those some people used to add ambiance to their showers and private moments: oils, candles, and special powders. Even if they found something, no one would think anything of it. They would think that the detective has a certain charm. With the fool symbol in place, Klein closed his eyes and clasped his hands together in front of it. The fool who does not belong to this era. With the prayer given and the murmur reaching his ears, Klein wasted no time in taking the 4 steps counterclockwise. Opening his eyes in this mysterious room and sitting in his chair of honor, the clown focused on the pulsating crimson star and extended his hand towards it, his spirituality flowing and quickly discharging. As he formed the mysterious and almost illusory doorway that revealed his bathroom, the clown did not waste a moment in picking up the objects on the altar. With them in front of him, Klein immediately closed the door. He massaged his head a little, and then, with a sigh, he looked at the objects in front of him. First, he put the money Chariot paid him in the corner with the rest of his savings. With that done, he grabbed one of the pens as he rose from his place of honor. A few steps later, he was standing next to the seat where Chariot sat. Looking up and down, the clown saw no difference from the other 21, but that did not depress him. Recalling the Emperor's experience with the mirror, Klein knew that just because an object was unchanged did not mean that it had not been corrupted. The change may be in the essence and not the appearance. Baitum. Feeling his heart pounding, the clown closed his eyes for a moment and entered cogitation to calm himself. Even if something goes wrong and I suffer some backlash, I should be fine. This place could withstand the attack of the eternal blazing sun. Whatever method Chariot uses, it can't compare to the power of a true god. If even a true god couldn't kill him in this place, then he would be able to deal with whatever Chariot has. Besides, if there's a backlash, I might learn some new formulas to sell. He may not be a god, but Chariot is a demigod. I should be able to acquire at least 1 or 2 new formulas. Klein muttered a little. Maybe he can finally find out which pathway Chariot is. Accepting the consequences and ready to take whatever might happen, his hand reached up and touched the seat's armrest. As soon as his finger made contact, Klein felt it. His body shivered and turned pale, a white cloud rising from his suddenly agitated breathing. So cold. Klein gritted his teeth and flicked his suddenly numb tongue. It was as if he'd fallen into a frozen lake. Gritting his teeth as hard as he could and guided by his thoughts, the clown endured the icy bone gnawing and sat down, legs and arms trembling. An airless sigh left his body, and for a moment, all sensation died. Then, a great exhaustion washed over him. The clown's clouded eyes flashed with alarm as he struggled to keep his head up. Fighting the almost irresistible urge to close his eyes and fall asleep, Klein quickly summoned some of the power of the mysterious space. The gray mist that seemed to be everywhere moved, a small part of it covering the man's head. Letting out a long breath, Klein leaned forward and put his hand to his chest. His heart beat exceptionally slowly, in contrast to the fear he felt. Death pathway, the man murmured in disbelief, trying to recover from the episode. What he had just felt was identical to what he had felt when he had faced that ghost in the ruined castle. But the sensation was much greater. Klein swallowed saliva and clenched his shaking fists, trying to regain his senses. His body was numb, and he could barely feel anything, but it was bearable, if barely. Not feeling anything and still being able to move his body gave him a highly uncomfortable disembodied feeling, but that wasn't bothering him now. What bothered Klein now was not the lack of sensation in his body but the possible revelation of Chariot's pathway. It is impossible for him to be part of the death pathway. All the abilities he has shown do not match those of that path. And not only that, the personalities don't match at all. His sweet and kind teacher stood next to the mischievous and malicious Chariot. The fact that these two subjects, so different from each other, were on the same path sent a chill through his body. Klein shook his head vigorously and laughed ungracefully and loudly. Yes, that's right, they have nothing in common. If Chariot was indeed from the same pathway, then Mr. Azek would have some characteristics, someone who is undoubtedly a higher sequence than him. Ha ha, ha ha, ha, but, just because they don't have any similarities or similar personalities doesn't mean they aren't from the same path. Maybe it's the same case with Captain Dunn and Leonard. They both are from the sleepless pathway, but their personalities were quite different. After a few seconds of silence, the clown scoffed with a confused look before shaking his head. No, that's not it. I'm sure Chariot isn't part of the death pathway. It must be another one. Maybe what I'm sensing is the result of an artifact made from the high sequence characteristics of the death pathway. That made the most sense. Of course, it could be the other way around. Of course, he had also noticed that it could be the sleepless pathway, but that made even less sense. Well, Leonard was a bit flirtatious, too. But never as much as Chariot. There is a similarity. Of course, he couldn't forget the biggest one. Both men were very attractive. Putting that aside, Klein patted his chest and, after confirming that his heart was still beating, albeit incredibly slowly, he let out a long sigh. If this is just the residue of the artifact, what would the real one be like? The actual artifact would undoubtedly be much more powerful. Without the protection of this mysterious space, I would undoubtedly have fallen asleep, and who knows what would have happened there. Not to mention the fact that I can barely feel my body. How can Chariot bear this? This, nothing. A demigod loses part of his humanity when he ascends. Klein thought, then sighed. As long as he didn't lose too much of himself, he was willing to tolerate it as long as he returned home. Thinking of his goal, the man opened his left hand, and a pendulum hung from his wrist. Klein then shaped a piece of goatskin in a red fountain pen. Dream divination was the most effective method he had tried so far to find someone. Not only did it give a general area, but if the level difference between the target of his divination and himself was not too significant, nor did they have a powerful seal artifact, Klein could even see a good approximation of where they are. With a slightly shaking hand, he wrote, "It is safe to divine with dream divination on this sea." The clown's mind formed a scene so quickly that the man almost screamed. Unlike the usual myriad of colored lights that joined together to form a scene, Klein watched as dozens of multiple pieces of glass manifested from the void itself, quickly joining together to form something resembling a window. In that window, Klein saw himself, sitting in Chariot's seat, wearing a calm, relaxed expression, his eyes closed. Sleeping peacefully. But that peace was soon shattered as a black liquid began to drip from the tears in his eyes, followed by his nose and ears. In a few seconds, his body became illusory, as if it were about to disappear. Just as his body was about to disappear, the gray mist around him boiled over, and in the next second, his body exploded in a crimson and black rain. After an unknown amount of time, blood began to pool on the seat again. But in the midst of all that crimson, there were black shadows without light. The blood finally condensed and took human form, and after he stopped writhing, his body repaired itself, his eyes closed, and he seemed to be asleep. When Klein, opened his eyes, they were no longer the dark brown he had expected, they were now a deep black that swallowed everything white. And with those black eyes etched in marble in his mind, the image shattered, and all Klein could see was the half-finished sentence. Crack, the pendulum in his hand, which he hadn't even used yet, shattered into several pieces, each of which splashed a strange black liquid. Without a second's delay, as soon as the black liquid appeared, the cleaning system of this place began to act. It quickly wiped away every trace of it. Quote. Klein looked at this with tight lips. Dream divination is out of the question. Muttering a little, the clown nodded slightly to himself. This was a conclusion based on what he had seen in the vision and a reminder of his spirituality. Even now, he could hear their murmurs so faint that they could easily go unnoticed, but they were there nonetheless. Don't fall asleep, don't fall asleep, don't fall asleep, don't fall asleep. Since the day he lost everything, Klein had not thought of ignoring such a clear reminder. Now, he was confused, but after some thought, the simple explanation presented itself. Lightly patting Chariot's seat, the man could only whistle in appreciation. This chair greatly enhances my spirituality and intuition. It also seems to increase mysticism exponentially. The pendulum divination from earlier was proof. A simple divination was raised to this level. I didn't even finish the preparations. Just with the intention and what I needed to know, I got such a clear revelation. And not only did I get an answer, but I even saw what would happen. It was a tremendous increase. Day and night, if I could siphon off some of this augmentation and keep it here, not only would my work as a detective be a hell of a lot easier, but many dangers that would otherwise remain hidden due to my low level would be revealed to me. The clown muttered with a hint of excitement before closing his eyes and shaking his head. Sigh, but it won't be possible, the remains in this chair aren't as strong anymore. Klein groaned a little. The feeling in his body had returned considerably and it was no longer so difficult for him to move or stay awake. Each use takes a portion of the residue in the chair. The change most likely activates the purification of this mysterious space and cleanses what comes out of the used leak. In other words, the more he used the chair, the less energy would be left until it was completely purified. Klein wasn't too worried about that. With Chariot's weekly visits, it would only be a matter of time before the chair had a full battery. His hand reached up, and he squeezed and opened it a few times. Feeling his palm, the force against it, and the fingers stretching as he opened it. From the feeling I got back, I'd say I used about 20% of the chair's power. It was more of a guess than a reliable measurement. Empirical method aside, Klein simply held out his hand. The gray fog trembled slightly, and behind its mirage, he pulled out a simple bathroom mirror, which floated in front of him. If dream divination was out, there would always be mirror divination. If the backlash of divination was unavoidable, he would use the mirror as a substitute. Taking one of the many pens, Klein began to trace various symbols around the mirror's edges, writing one sentence after another. The divination he knew the least about was undoubtedly mirror divination, but he wasn't worried that it would affect him too much. The bounce of the chair would make up for any shortcomings on his part. So the clown, barely completing one lap around the mirror's surface, finished the sentence by drawing a pupilless eye with twisted lines. The ink melted and concentrated in the mirror's center, creating a sizable black swirl. The swirl quickly disintegrated, and the dispersing black took on various colors. The wave of color eventually condensed into abstract shapes, but these soon took on a clear form. Massive, dark-trunked, slightly moldy trees filled the canvas. Large puddles filled with mud, fallen leaves, and twigs covered the ground. But what stood out most was a freshly dug mound of earth, from which a pale, dirty hand reached out slightly, the earth slowly swallowing it. Uniformed men, wearing dark blue vests with insignia on their chests, walked the scene. Yellow tape surrounded the scene nearby. Another group of men arrived with more prepared equipment and clothing and, wearing gloves, slowly began to remove the dirt around the arm. The scene quickened, and now two bodies lay on two white blankets. Dirt covered their bodies except for their faces, which had been wiped with a towel. With now clean faces, bruises were now visible, along with a small hole in the center of their foreheads. Meat and signs of decay already adorning the bodies. The faces were the same as those on the envelope from the job Chariot had ordered. One of the uniformed men took a small notebook from a pocket and began to write with a pencil. Saturday the 8th of September. 2 bodies found in Lumia Forest at 10:34 a.m. As the date showed, The scene quickly changed from the forest's depths to the outskirts. Rows and rows of houses could be seen, illuminated by rays of sunlight breaking through the storm clouds. Suddenly, the scene zoomed rapidly into a city street, showing the slightly fragmented streets and then focusing on a particular house. This house was painted light blue, with a sizable cross-shaped window above the dark wooden door and an orange fireplace. Another zoomed through, this time into the house, showing a bit of its interior. It then went up the stairs to the second floor and into the last door on the right. A bedroom, the bed and its headboard lying there torn, with their filling scattered across the shattered floor. The wooden floor itself was shredded in several places. The scene then changed to an aerial view showing the blue house. The image then moved slightly to the side, towards a simple yellow house in the distance. Another zoomed through its doorway, up the stairs, and across the roof. In the corner, a large reddish-brown sack was hidden, with some weaves adorning its old leather. The scenery changed again, this time showing a large sign. The town with the large forest in the distance was named Wach on this sign. Crack, as he watched the crystal fragments stained with the same black liquid being cleaned, Klein sighed, slightly disappointed, and clenched his fists. The feeling has completely returned. The chair has used all its power. He had somehow expected this but couldn't help but be annoyed. Unlike the other divinations he had tried here, mirror divination never became stronger. Sometimes, it was even worse because it wasted too much spirituality, and the results were incredibly lacking. It was almost useless. The results had never been as clean and precise as this try, so he rarely used it. I hope it doesn't take too long to recharge. Murmuring a little, Klein just let it go and got up from the chariot. As he walked to his place of honor at the top, his eyes wandered a little to where he had been a moment ago. He noticed again how far away it was from the others. Won't he feel left out, being so far away? It's almost the last seat. Well, Chariot hasn't said anything yet, and maybe it's for the best. If he were near Sun, Hanged Man, and Justice, he would have spoiled them by now. Chariot being away from the others was the best for everyone. Besides, I can use it as an excuse. The blessed sit in the back, the less fortunate at my side, like children who must be watched to keep them from getting into mischief, while the more mature have more freedom, yay. Patting himself on the back for such a brilliant idea, Klein took his place at the end of the table, his cheek quickly resting on his right knuckle as his free hand began to tap the table in a slow rhythm. Projecting the half-buried hand into the mud he had seen, the detective nodded quietly to himself. My targets are dead. Even though people had died, Klein couldn't help but feel relieved. The job Chariot had given him was to see what had become of the previous owner and his assistant, nothing more. Although, not because he had discovered what had happened to them, his job was done. The image projected in front of him changed to the bag of a moment ago. Licking his parched lips, Klein held out his hand where a coin had appeared and flicked it into the air. The coin made a high arc before descending and landing in the center of his palm. Clink. Smiling at the result, Klein could have sworn he heard the sound of money. The money from the sale of the company was in the bag. Rubbing his hands together, the man let out a soft sigh to calm his desire to collect such a juicy reward. A gang was after them. I have to be careful. No matter how juicy the reward is, it won't matter if I die trying to get it. Since it hasn't been found yet. Those two didn't tell anyone where they hid it. Whether that killed them or not, I don't know, but it doesn't matter now. The divination date was Saturday the 8th of September, so it was in the future. If the money had not been found in the remaining days, and with the police now investigating, those who killed the previous owner and his assistant would have to go into hiding for the time being. Of course, this doesn't mean they will stop looking for the money. They'll just be more careful. If I didn't know where the bag was, it would be dangerous, but that's not the case. He still had a few days before the meeting, so he had time to prepare. First, he had to find out where the town was. The name didn't ring a bell, so he'd have to ask. Tap tap tap, looks like I won't be sleeping well for a few days. Klein mumbled with an amused smile as he shook his head. While a part of him was disappointed to lose a little sleep, that part was completely drowned out, crushed, smashed, and devoured by a much bigger giant. And that was the promise of money. It is not greed, it is mere acquisition. Like a monk from the highest mountains, Klein's face was calm and full of wisdom. Ignoring the sound of the piggy bank that threatened to break his head, Klein laughed merrily. The man closed his eyes and let himself fall with nothing more to say, leaving the mysterious space. Later that day, Oldia District, choo-choo. Exiting the train, Klein looked around the station and nodded inwardly. He wore a large light brown coat and black gloves, and his laurel held his hair in place. He carried a dark blue travel briefcase. His appearance was slightly different. His beard was now a light gray. His hair was slicked back, showing his somewhat wrinkled forehead, and white lines ran over his ears. Clowns were naturally skilled with makeup, so making himself look several decades older and changing his face a bit was no problem. Once, he took a break to regain his lost spirituality and had another breakfast for the day ahead. He then performed several divinations in the space above the gray fog to locate the place he had seen in the mirror divination. Luckily, locating the spot he had seen was not difficult. After the divinations, he simply consulted some people on the streets and found what he was looking for relatively quickly. Apparently, it was a relatively popular place to visit in the fall. Walking out of the train station, the detective looked up at the large sign hanging from the ceiling. Welcome to Wach. Even by Lindbergh standards, that's an odd name. Did whoever was naming this place headbutt the keyboard and take the first word that made any sense? Klein raised an eyebrow for a moment before shaking his head. It's not as if he could judge people's naming ability. That aside, the detective continued on his way out of the train station and onto the sidewalk, his gaze inevitably drawn to the large forest on the edge of town. The lush, large trees obscured the sun and cast large shadows. This was only part of the largest forest in the country, the Lumia Forest. It was quite a beautiful sight. Northern Lindbergh was known for this same forest, but Klein was most interested in the buildings and atmosphere. The traces of the Fanapotter kingdom were stronger here than in any other part of Lindbergh. The houses, streets, people, and atmosphere screamed history, making the historian inside him tremble with excitement. A single stone in the street was already older than his whole family put together. Several projects have been implemented to maintain that 700-plus-year-old history. To maintain the diverse fauna of the area, Lindbergh came up with a somewhat peculiar solution. Instead of making a big city with a small park in the middle, they decided to make a series of towns that would function as mini-cities placed in a series of 30 across the northern part of the country. There was not much difference in each one, the only difference would be in the population that varied from town to town, but they were never less than 50,000. This number obviously increased with the arrival of autumn and winter, which were the major tourist points. Wach is the 13th village in the series of 30. It is a little further away from the rest and one of the oldest, being one of the first built after the country's independence from the Fanapotter kingdom. The best place to make a deal with gangs, Klein noted, away from the controlled Ashera to an old town in the middle of a rich forest in the oldest parts of the country. The same forest that can be used to escape if things get complicated and hide in until the coast is free. Remembering the sight of the buried bodies, Klein just took a breath. Sure, the same forest can be used to hide forever. Looking around as he walked through the town, the detective noticed the occasional passing policeman, either on foot or on horseback, none alone but always in at least 2 pairs. Inhaling calmly, the clown did not hurry to search for the yellow house but strolled a little around Wach. Noticing the colorful houses, the movement of the inhabitants, and the surprising smell of the forest. He looked up at the cloudy sky and the darkening clouds. With autumn arriving in full force, the trees were not the only ones to show it. The weather was also celebrating in its way with more frequent rain. Using his intuition and the streets he had seen in the mirror revelation, he found the street and yellow house where his target was, but he did not rush in to get the money. Although it was late, the streets were still quite busy, something that would only jeopardize him. So, remembering the location of the yellow house for later, Klein wandered as best he could through Wach, spending several hours there. Occasionally buying a bit of street food or a drink, he seemed like just another tourist, someone who decided to pay a short visit to this small town to get a taste of its culture. About 2 hours after arriving in town, it began to drizzle lightly, but Klein knew it was likely to get worse soon. The streets quickly emptied. Feeling that his short sightseeing was over, the clown began to look for a place to rest for the time being. Normally, he would go to one of the many restaurants until the rain passed, but given what he planned to do, it was better to be somewhere more private. Being a tourist town, it didn't take Klein long to find a motel where he could rest. Paying 4 argentum for the rest of the day and night, he closed the door to his room and looked around with a critical eye. A bed for one, a simple wooden desk, and the heater resting in one corner. A window perched on the side, and the soft tapping of the glass from the water droplets gave the room tranquility. The view to the sky was decent, but to the ground, it was not so good as it overlooked an alley. Good enough. Nodding in satisfaction, Klein placed his briefcase on top of the desk as he closed the curtain with his free hand. Reaching into his sack, he pulled out a silver knife. After forming a wall of spirituality and performing a short divination to confirm his current security, the clown finally relaxed. Now for the fun part. With both hands on the latch of his briefcase, Klein pressed them together, and a slight click sounded. Opening it, the first thing that greeted the man was a change of dark clothing. Moving the clothes aside, various materials were revealed: candles, oils, herb powders, everything needed to make a sacrificial altar. He didn't plan to sacrifice anything yet, he just needed to open the window, to come out to breathe. Therefore, the only thing he took from that group was a candle influenced by sandalwood, essences, extracts, and herbal powders that symbolized mystery and good luck. Following the steps of ritualistic magic, Klein lit the candle with his spirituality, allowing a flickering flame to illuminate the room as he spread the extracts, essences and herbal powders. After checking that the altar was in order and that nothing had been forgotten, Klein shouted in Jotun, "I." Pausing for a moment, he switched to Hermes, "I summon in my name. The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." The moment the incantation began, the flickering candle flame merged with the harmonious scenery to form an illusory vortex that sucked spirituality madly. But as soon as Klein finished the incantations, the vortex stabilized into a palm-sized circle of gray-white fog. As soon as that happened, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the space above the gray fog. Without further delay, he felt the spirituality surge into the door, which was complete and filled with mysterious patterns, unlike the sacrificial door. Immediately with the formation of that gate, Klein felt the pull. He did not struggle but let himself be pulled by it into the gate. After a moment of calm with nothing, he finally opened his eyes and saw his body sitting in front of a palm-sized circle of gray-white fog. He learned this once he had better mastered the sacrificial ritual and was inspired by Chariot's messenger's summoning method. Klein could summon his spirit body by using an altar similar to the summoning altar and changing the last lines to his honorific name. He was now a ghost, invisible to ordinary people. What better method to explore than this? Of course, he could barely interact with the physical world. His form was incredibly weak, and the only way to strengthen it was to absorb spiritually charged objects. Grasping Mr. Azek's copper whistle, Klein quickly absorbed it into himself. His eyes turned into 2 illusory dark flames, and his spirituality expanded and froze. With all the preparations ready for the exploration, Klein made a small window in the wall of spirituality, calmly exiting, closed it, and stepped out into the dark rainy outdoors. Being now a spirit that was also powered by an object charged by the spirituality of a death pathway beyonder, the sun was a great weakness of his. If exposed to it, the summoning would stop and return to the mysterious space. However, if he still had the flaring sun charms, this might not have been a problem, but that wasn't the case. Klein could not maintain this spirit state for long. Even with the copper whistle stabilizing his spirit body, it only gave him a few extra minutes. But those minutes were more than enough for what he wanted to do. The motel he had chosen was 2 blocks from the yellow house. Klein carefully approached, moving through the shadows and hiding in the thick rain. Just because normal people couldn't see him didn't mean he had to fly over everyone. Ads by PubFuture. Even if it is a village, its size is not small. Therefore, it should have at least 1 team from the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Not because he had a good relationship with one of their members would he dare risk provoking them. Nor could he rule out the possibility of wild beyonders. It was better to be cautious. So, Klein flew carefully and cautiously to his first target. It wasn't the yellow house, but the light blue house not far from it, the same he saw in the mirror divination. He did not enter the light blue house directly but circled it, peering slightly out of the windows. At the second floor window, the clown stared, stunned at what was in front of him. Dieter Smyke rummaged through some documents, his expression nervous, and sweat clung to his shirt. Next to him, William, who looked even more nervous, was stuffing various things into a briefcase. Weren't they dead? What does this mean? The mirror divination was wrong. While completely taken aback, he knew that time was running out, so he could only leave this for later. After finding everything he was looking for, Klein left the blue house and focused on his second target, the yellow house at the end of the street. Using the shadows and the thick rain, it floated there undetected. Carefully, he repeated the same process, peeking slightly out of the windows. The house was empty, with only essential furnishings as far as Klein could see. A light layer of dust adorned some of the furniture. A rental house. Klein whistled inwardly in surprise. A house that spends most of the year empty and with almost no activity is a good place to hide money. Dieter Smyke seemed to have it all figured out. Sure, except for getting caught. Klein raised a ghostly eyebrow. Seeing that the house was safe, Klein floated up to the roof, using the shadows as a hiding place, and went straight through the wall. Immediately, his eyes were drawn to a reddish-brown bag hidden deep within it. Contrary to his vision, it was relatively clean. There were no cobwebs. Floating up to the bag, Klein could only stare at it with some regret. If my spirit body were stronger, I might be able to take it with me now, but at the moment, it's impossible. If I want to take it, I must come and get it. Having confirmed his target state and sensing the time limit he could maintain this state approaching, Klein cut the summoning short. His spirit body disappeared from the attic and reappeared in the space above the gray fog, whose place he also left just as quickly. Holding a hand to his head and grunting in pain, the clown closed his eyes and began to use cogitation to calm down. Once he was better, the man pulled a single vial from his open briefcase and downed the contents in one sip. Feeling the Evernight powder potion accelerate his recovery of lost spirituality, the clown smiled slightly. Thank you, old Neil. Closing the vial and putting it away, Klein frowned slightly at the results of his short exploration. The bag is practically brand new. It's not covered in cobwebs yet, and has no dust on it either. According to the results of the mirror divination, the bag has been there for a long time. Frowning slightly, the man sat on the small bed and covered his chin in deep thought. Ever since he had seen the divination results, he had been confused. From the state of the bodies, it was clear that the men had been tortured before they died, and that was a problem. No matter if the torturer was a professional or a beyander, in the face of torture, any normal person would break down and say anything to avoid more pain. Considering the profile of Dieter Smyke and William, both men feared death and the gang they owed money to. Given all that, it's ridiculous to think they didn't hand over the money as soon as they received it. With their profiles, it would never come to torture. Closing his eyes, the clown sighed a little before opening them again. The date on the divination was September 8th. That is, 4 days from today. The bodies' state suggests that they should have been decomposing for several days, maybe even weeks, but that is not the case. They were buried in the forest, where predators, constant rain, and insects would accelerate the decomposition of the bodies. He wasn't part of the death pathway, so Klein couldn't say for sure when they died, but if Klein had to give an estimate, it would be between tonight and tomorrow. Klein's blood froze, and he felt a horrible chill run through his bones. The result of the mirror divination was not a revelation of the future like he thought it was. It was what would happen if he intervened. That was why the divination was so weird. It showed him two results simultaneously while making it appear like only one result. There are two possibilities and two endings. The divination showed that the bag was still in the same place where he had found it but had not moved. That meant something would happen to him if he looked for it now. Something that made him unable to retrieve the bag even after 4 days. Something that ended up getting both Dieter and William tortured and killed. This both confused and unnerved Klein, but he remained calm. All the divinations he had done before coming here gave the same result. The danger was not great and was even relatively low. Therefore, it was not that his life would be in danger but that it was very likely that he would only be unable to obtain the bag as a result. Kidnapping? No, if so, the danger would increase and would be reflected in the divination. Klein frowned slightly. What would keep him unable to retrieve the money at the same time that was not dangerous? Lowering his hand, Klein stared incredulously at the opposite wall. Am I going to be arrested? It was the most logical option. Normally, being arrested shouldn't bring too much trouble, but Klein's situation was special. Not only had he entered the country with false documents, but he was also a wild viander. That is the danger that the divination showed. Klein brightened in realization before frowning slightly. But, shouldn't the danger be greater? Normally, being caught by the police as a wild viander would be very dangerous, even deadly. Being a theocratic country, I would no doubt be reported to the church, of course. It did not matter if the police caught him. Neither would that they discover that he was a wild viander, much less if they discovered that all his documents were fake. If he is handed over to the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, he has the best answer. His get-out-of-jail-free card, chariot. Is this what it's like to have powerful contacts? Klein mumbled a little, unsure how he should feel about it. Shaking his head, the detective dismissed his earlier plan. Knowing now that his targets are alive, Klein couldn't just take the money and let them get killed. The next time I use Chariot's seat, I will do a divination to confirm the information. This problem was because I put all my trust in that. Never again. Klein put this deep between his soul. If he hadn't checked the blue house, he would have killed 2 men because of taking the bag. Divination isn't all-powerful. It will never change that just because I cheated by using the seat. Sighing slightly, the man prepared a sacrificial altar and sacrificed himself a piece of paper and a pen. In the mysterious space, Klein wrote a short letter, which he threw back outside as soon as it was finished. He didn't have many anti-divination methods, so he could only use the one that worked best. He wrote the letter in that mysterious space and concealed it using its unique properties. Originally, he planned to report the duo's problem to the police, but according to the divination, that may or may not have led to his arrest, so Klein had to change his method. Just because they owe money to gangs doesn't mean they deserve to die. Sighing a little, the clown began to change his clothes into dark ones as he wiped the makeup on his face and applied a different one. His face now had several black spots, and a simple black mask reached up to his nose. His shirt and vest were replaced by a large black windbreaker that reached to his knees with a black hood. He had several cards in his pockets that he could use as projectiles, along with some slumber charms and all the materials for a sacrificial ritual. While the plan had changed, the objective remained the same. Ads by PubFuture. It's payment for saving their lives. Why should I feel bad if I take it? He had already made the journey here and did not plan to return home without that bag. But for that reason, the way to get it had changed slightly. Once he was ready, he didn't immediately go outside but waited until the rain was heaviest. Placing the Do Not Disturb sign on his door and keeping the wall of spirituality raised, he opened the window and quickly hung on the frame. With a deft flick of his wrist, he closed the window again, falling to the ground almost noiselessly. Looking up and confirming that he had closed the window, Klein quickly moved into the shadows. The heavy rain made it difficult to see, obscuring his figure and the sound of his quick footsteps. He was not worried that the sound of the wind rushing into his room would alarm anyone. The wall of spirituality contains any disturbance that might happen in it, such as the sound of wind and rain from an open window. Arriving at the yellow house, the clown moved carefully along the side, almost sticking to the wall. Reaching the back door, the man pulled out a card and, with a flick of his wrist, opened it. Stepping inside and quickly closing the door, Klein shivered at the cold he now felt. Watching the drops falling to the floor, he could only press his lips together and ignore them. Using any entrance other than the back would only leave him exposed, so wetting the floor would be inevitable. Well, it's not like it's impossible to fix the problem, Klein thought after a moment's consideration as he moved carefully through the house. The clown jumped up the stairs to the first floor. Then, grabbing the rope to the attic, he pulled it, letting the stairs down. Climbing with a pounding heart, Klein stepped carefully through the boxes and cobwebs to the corner of the attic, where a dark red bag rested. Breathing tensely, the clown held back his strong desire to open the bag. He reached out his left hand and let his topaz pendulum fall free. After confirming that it was safe, Klein wasted no more time and, with trembling hands, opened the bag. Seeing the sea of yellow inside the bag, the detective could only close his eyes, and with almost tears coming out of them, he taped his chest 4 times in a circle. Praise the lady. Amid his praise, Klein paused for a moment before raising his hand and giving a military salute, praise the monarch. It was fitting to praise the Scarlet Monarch as well. After all, it was his blessed one who gave him this mission. Not only did I get the money I would need to obtain my magician ingredients, but when I deliver the results of my extensive research to Chariot, he will pay me again. Klein thought ecstatically, the huge grin he now wore almost splitting his face. This is like a legal scam. Barely containing a chuckle, Klein reached into the bag, but before pulling anything out, he paused. Single quote. Single quote. Looking deeply at the large amount of money in the bag, Klein could only sigh sadly. The main ingredients are not as expensive as the formula, but their price should not be less than half. So, more or less, the price of a main ingredient of a sequence 7 formula should be around 1800 sasam. Adding the secondary ingredients and the missing main ingredient would be 3900 or 4000 sasam. With the mental calculations done, Klein only took out what he needed. Not 1 sasam more, not 1 sasam less. While he could tell it had lost a considerable amount of weight, the bag was still quite full. There must be at least another 6000 sasam left in there. Ignoring the temptation to take out even more money, Klein set the bag aside and left it where it was. The action being extremely painful. I blame you for this, old Neil. I hope you're all right where you are. His decision was influenced in part by his teacher's example of the wallet. Klein knew better than to take more than was offered. Being a seer and already having a decent amount of experience in the Beyonder world, he knew that one of the worst things he could do was to push his luck. It was already very fortunate that the mission of Chariot paid very well. That divination using the man's chair also worked and had stupendous results. The same divinations that revealed to him the exact location of his targets and, to top it all off, the exact location of the money. Not to mention that the targets themselves did not spend the money and kept it in a place that was relatively easy to access. Klein refused to believe that he could have such good luck. And even if he did, it was obvious that he was using it too much. If I keep abusing my luck, all I'll accomplish will be to bring on a run of bad fortune. If my good fortune is like this, I don't want to imagine how disastrous the opposite will be. Klein could not help but think of the half-monster boy Ademisal, whose good fortune had prevented Klein from catching him to the point of almost severely injuring or even killing him, but all that good fortune was reversed when the boy entered Chariot's workplace, and Chariot captured him without any problems. The longer the streak of good luck, the worse the fall will be if you don't know how to control it. Not grabbing more than he needed was Klein's way of avoiding falling into the abyss of bad luck. Honestly, the streak had been so good that Klein wanted to suspect something, but he had no evidence to do so. There were no coincidences and no evidence to point to. Everything that had happened seemed to have been nothing more than pure luck. Shaking his head, Klein put aside the subject of his fortune and pulled out a silver knife. Making a wall of spirituality, the man quickly prepared to make a sacrificial ritual to bring the money into the mysterious space. He would not dare go out on the street with that much money in hand. That was begging to be robbed. Opening his eyes after putting the money away, Klein rubbed his forehead with a frown. A small grunt escaped him. The familiar murmurs annoyed him for the 5th time that day. Hornassus, Phlegre, Hornassus, I've never spent so much spirituality in a single day. I'll have to take it slower these days. At least until the party with Mr. Chariot. Sigh, using cogitation until the murmurs were gone, Klein cleaned the altar and any possible traces it may have left rigorously. Seeing that everything was as he had entered, the clown carefully went down to the 1st floor and entered one of the rooms, opening the window. The wind and the heavy rain entered the house with force, filling everything with water. He repeated the same thing downstairs, opening the windows and letting the rain in, making sure it looked like the intense wind had opened them. With his goal accomplished, the man left the yellow house and moved carefully. He did not return to his motel but took a small detour until he ended up in an alley in front of the blue house with a large cross-shaped window. Calmly, he pulled the letter he had written out of his pocket. With a flick of his wrist, the paper stiffened. Then, Klein threw the letter hard into the cross-shaped window. Crack! Without waiting to see the results, Klein quickly made his getaway. Inside the light blue house, at the entrance, William, who had been in the living room when something broke the window, read the letter in his hands with terror. The red ink, slightly runny from the water, only added to the panic in his heart. The gang does not plan to honor the deal, and will kill you. If you don't flee now, you will be buried in the forest. Turning around, the man ran to the second floor, his face clear with panic. Boss Dieter, who had finished preparing train tickets, watched in a daze as William came screaming into the room, holding a letter. Before he could demand an explanation, the letter was almost shoved in his face. Reading the contents, the former owner blanched and quickly grabbed his tickets. I knew that guy was unreliable piece of shit. Screaming in terror, the man moved in panic. We're leaving now. Grabbing what they could in panic, both men ran out of the house. Terrified, they went to the hiding place where they had stashed the money. Ignoring the storm-opened windows, they climbed into the attic and removed the bag. By 2100 on Tuesday, both men left Achiad on the last train. In their panic, they did not realize that the bag was lighter than it should have been until they were about to leave the country the following day. With deft movements and exaggerated moves worthy of an acrobat, Klein quickly made it to the window of his room. Closing it, the man sighed as he pulled down his hood and removed his simple mask. Klein calmly removed his makeup with a simple handkerchief and changed back into his clothes, storing everything he had worn in his briefcase. In his original disguise, the clown lay heavily on the bed. He planned to use this entire night to rest before returning to the district and accepting Chariot's invitation. Running away now may be suspicious, so it was better to avoid problems. Wayne Enterprise, Harvey Wayne's office. The next morning, Wednesday. You don't look well, detective. Trouble sleeping. Adrian looked somewhat surprised at the man in front of him, who looked more like a raccoon than a man. And whose fault is it? Klein swallowed his bitter complaint and just smiled as he bowed slightly. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Wayne, but you have nothing to worry about. Your assignment just kept me a little busy. A black eyebrow curved gracefully, and the dark-haired man joked, you know you didn't have to finish it so quickly, right? Quote. For a moment, Klein tensed, and his mouth dropped a little, a slight blush adorning his cheeks at the rather improper words that could easily be misunderstood. Foo-foo, I'm just kidding, Mr. Moriarty. Laughing with satisfaction, Adrian watched as the detective gave him a flat look. Not wanting to waste the man's time any longer, he got to the point. Well, have you thought about what I mentioned? Klein paused. Then, his gaze turned to the woman with white hair standing a few meters to the man's right. The woman's gray eyes showed nothing but disinterest. Turning his attention back to the man and thinking about what to say for a few seconds, he nodded. It would be a pleasure, Mr. Wayne. If Chariot didn't ask the woman to leave, she was trustworthy, so there was no problem discussing the subject. However, that didn't mean he would be very direct, it wasn't necessary. Adrian applauded, a big smile on his face. Wonderful, I'll be waiting for you on Friday at 11:30 a.m. at Warehouse 7 in the Artelia district. It's located on Artiro Street, the farthest one. You can't get confused. Please don't be late. As if I could afford that. Holding the corners of his lips, the detective nodded. Leaning back in his chair and no longer so serious, Adrian rested his cheek against his knuckles. With the most important thing dealt with. Tell me, how have those guys been? Any problems? Are they still breathing? They're both alive, Klein replied. I managed to find out that the gang they owed money to planned to kill them after getting it. So I warned them, and they escaped. At this point, they should be at the Lindbergh border. Keeping quiet about how he had found out and that he had stolen some of the money, details he didn't see why he should share, Klein explained what he had done. He did not explain in depth. Not only because it was not necessary but also because, even now, Chariot showed little interest in the men he asked to investigate. Something that caught his attention slightly, but not much. The same man explained in the letter how it was merely a whim. Did you really wanted to know how they were, or was it just an excuse to have me running from one end of the country to the other? Klein suddenly felt enlightened. Was Chariot really that much of a rascal? Yes he was. Of course, Klein wouldn't complain out loud. The money he got made it all worthwhile. It seems that even idiots are blessed. Could this be the luck of the idiot? Adrian scratched his cheek without interest before laughing, amused. Good job, detective. I'm satisfied. Apparently, you didn't have any problems with that gang, huh? I barely knew what they were planning to do before I escaped. I stayed one night in a motel to avoid drawing attention to myself, and I left town on the first train in the morning. Klein said this was more of a half-truth, but it didn't matter. His job was not to investigate the gang, only Dieter and William. Nodding, the man asked no more questions. Adrian reached into his tunic and, taking out a thick wad of bills, threw it to the man. Here's payment for the full job. Thanks for saving those guys, I guess. Quickly but carefully counting the money, Klein contained his happiness as he put the 200 sasam into his pocket. It's a pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Wayne. Ads by PubFuture. Watching the man leave, Flora waited a few seconds before turning to look at her companion. Why did you do that? Her tone was not accusatory but a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Oh, and what makes you think I did something? Adrian giggled innocently as he looked at her mischievously. Why would you suddenly be interested in finding out the status of those two idiots? That was a lie. If you were really interested you would have investigated them a long time ago, you wouldn't hire a detective you hardly know. Your real objective was to get that detective to do something. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure you achieved it because of that stupid smile on your face. Flora looked at the man with calculating eyes. Everything he had done these last few days regarding this detective had been strange, which piqued her curiosity. Her cryptologist was highly interested in this. Perceptive, huh, nothing gets past you. Adrian closed his eyes with a small smile, sinking deeper into his seat. Flora straightened slightly, the corners of her lips rising slightly. Praise is welcome, princess, but please don't mention the obvious. Why did you hire that guy? If I'm honest with you, Abigail, it was a mere excuse. Adrian admitted with a shrug. Her new identity was that of the bodyguard, Abigail Rhodes. A 26-year-old woman, she had spent the last 5 years in the Lowen Kingdom learning sufficient skills to help her in her career. Oh, her head tilted slightly. She hadn't expected that answer. Excuse. The dark-haired man nodded, an extremely hurt expression on his face. It may not look like it. But I do have a heart here, he said as he covered his chest. How could I not reach out to help the most unfortunate? Look at that detective. He went through so much trouble and took his body to the limit to complete my job, which I said didn't require any effort, and for what? Just for 300 sasam. Pressing his heart in great pain with his right hand, Adrian opened his eyes and looked at Flora with great pain. Oh, he must be in a terrible financial situation. How can I stand by and watch when someone suffers like that? Flora looked with a straight face at her companion's opera-worthy performance. Her expression was difficult to read, but she was clearly tired of his stupidity. Seeing the most important information among the meaningless verbiage he had just said, Flora exasperatedly pointed it out. Quote. It was an excuse to give him money. Right, of course. That guy would never accept a straight-up cash gift. He'd think it was cursed or that it was a trap. With a 180-degree personality change, Adrian replied, bored as he rolled his shoulders. And I thought it would be for a more important reason. Rolling her eyes, Flora sighed disappointedly as she focused on the cloudy sky. That he has money is important. The dark-haired man commented amusedly, his eyes shining as he thought about what he had done. Flora raised an eyebrow at that comment, but the man said no more. Flora didn't ask either. The information she had obtained was already enough, but it only left her with more questions than answers. Adrian, for his part, only gave enough to give the woman an idea. It didn't matter what she thought or how she saw it, as long as the context was missing, the cryptologist wouldn't understand the reason for his actions. How could he not know that with the promise of a good haul, the detective wouldn't give his all to fulfill his request? And that's not to mention that as soon as he found out they still had the money from the sale, he'd be off faster than the flash. Adrian laughed a little more without holding back. As a conspirator, how could he not know the status of the previous owner and the receptionist? Ads by PubFuture. He had already divined their status as soon as he mastered mirror divination and whether they still had the money. The detective's mission was nothing more than a way for Klein to get his hands on that juicy loot. As long as they know what they're doing. A conspirator doesn't have much to teach a hypnotist. They can even surpass them in some cases. After all, it's not as if I'm using powers, just my tongue and words. Once again, the dark-haired man could only praise the hunter's path while cursing all those who branded it as unremarkable in his world. It was not necessary for the target he wished to manipulate to be in front of him to achieve this. All he needed was a sufficient understanding of the target to gaslight and to use the right words in the letter. In this world, who knows Klein Moretti better than Adrian Kenway? All he had to do to motivate him was to put a few crumbs in the letter he sent him and make sure there was no danger. If there was one thing that would remain the same no matter how the story changed, it would be that the poor god would stay the poor god. In addition, of course, to his great love of money. It was child's play. The detective never stood a chance. Considering his personality and heart of gold, I doubt he took it all, just enough to buy the ingredients for his potion. Honestly, whether he took all the money or not, the dark-haired man didn't care. As long as Klein advanced to magician, everything would be fine. That was why he had invited him to the party on Friday. That was the reason he had manipulated the detective into investigating and obtaining the money. The Tarot Club was already at the limit of what Klein's spirituality could bear. The mere fact that the last meetings had been so short was proof of this. If that was not solved soon, dangerous events could bring horrible disasters. And considering that he carried the City of Calamities, the Sephira that shared the Red Priest and Demoness pathways, two paths focused on destruction and disaster, it was only a matter of time before that happened. Although the party might be a bit uncomfortable for him, the dark-haired man thought as he tapped his chin. He wouldn't go alone, and it wasn't that Klein wasn't very sociable, but at least at this point, it might be strange for him. Meh, it doesn't matter. Shaking his head, Adrian looked at his watch and saw the time. He sighed as he got up to make himself a cup of coffee. If that didn't bother him, then the party venue definitely would. Maybe I should mention it to him. Sighing and ignoring how one of the two cups disappeared, he raised his cup to his lips. Coffee in hand, the man returned to his desk and, taking out paper and pen, quickly wrote a letter to Opera inquiring about the status of a demisol. Closing the letter and adding the woman's initials, Adrian stretched his strings from his fingertips to the ceiling of his office. With a tug, a skeleton bell fell from the ceiling into his open palm. As he caught it, Adrian habitually took a bar of chocolate with nuts from his tunic and placed it next to the letter. The bell rang with a twist of the wrist, but no sound came out. A few moments passed, and then an icy breeze filled the office for 2 seconds before disappearing, the letter and chocolate bar sharing the same fate. One down, one to go. Adrian sighed softly as he looked at his mental calendar. Depending on the boy's state, a demisol would regain his sanity and become a complete monster this Saturday when he finished work at his company. And with a demisol as a monster, the next part of his plan with furs will be so much easier. Could this be considered acting in advance? The next sequence after clown is magician. If I go by the name, maybe one of the rules is to fool people with flashy and spectacular tricks. Could lying to a demigod be considered that? If so, a decent portion of my potion should be digested, shouldn't it? Klein lampooned as he went down the stairs to his kitchen. Sure, if I think about it some more, that would be more like a swindler and not a magician. Although, what is a magician, if not just a more fantastic swindler? Klein decided to give this some more thought. With his promotion approaching, it was best to be ready to start acting. A magician never performs unprepared. Repeating the words he had heard some time ago, he nodded slightly and lit his stove. He still needed to make himself some breakfast. Artelia District, Ermo Street. In one of the most famous streets in the entire Artelia District. A large silver and white striped tent stood proudly, its exaggerated peak drawing attention as soon as one entered the street, which would inevitably make people look down at the colorful poster on the side. The fabulous gaudy circus of the masked ones. Like any good circus, a large podium surrounded a large arena inside the striped tent. The podium was full of spectators, some with bags of popcorn and drinks and others with drinks only, but everyone was excitedly watching the performance to come. In the middle of the big arena, there was a person dressed in an exaggerated, colorful costume with extremely large shoulder pads and a relatively thin torso. The pants were highly baggy, and he wore a ridiculous hat with little bells on their head. A mask covered their face, and it had a painted smile. Stars of different sizes surrounded the eyeholes. Good afternoon, everyone. A woman's voice came from the figure, full of enthusiasm and childish mischief, infecting the crowd who shouted along with her. Woo, ha ha ha, that's the emotion we like. Laughing amusedly, the masked woman paused for a moment before bending over herself in clear sadness and depression. Sadly, It's almost time to close the show. Boo. The crowd's reproach was swift, clearly showing their discontent. Jumping on herself, the bells on her hat tinkled. But that's why I've prepared one last act for you. Courtesy of your good friend, Miss All-Trick. Miss All-Trick also raised a gloved hand and snapped her fingers loudly. Snap. A great white light came out of her, and the circus lights went out instantly. The sudden darkness sparked cries of alarm from the adults and screams of fear from the children. For a few seconds, that was the world as they knew it. Snap. With another snap of fingers, the light came on. The crowd exclaimed in fear, and the children applauded, amused, at what they saw. A large box in which a person could easily fit was now in front of the masked woman. It was covered with curious holes, barely allowing the inside to be seen. Several masked figures, dressed in the same way as the first, surrounded the box, but their costumes were completely white. A few of them had instruments, but what frightened the adult audience and excited the children was that most of them had sabers. Behold, Jack in the box, Miss All-Trick shouted, pointing to the box. I will be locked in that box if I don't get out before my faithful assistants finish the song. The masked woman signaled, and those with swords stuck their weapons into the holes. I will become a ball of threads. Don't do it, Miss All-Trick. You could get hurt. A little girl in the crowd screamed, drawing the woman's attention, who pointed a white finger at her. Don't worry, sweetheart, there's nothing I can't escape from. Finishing saying that, she laughed a little more and added, that's why we're going to make things more interesting. Extending her arms, two of the assistants quickly approached, carrying a straitjacket and several chains. Miss All-Trick did not struggle and allowed the straitjacket to be placed on her, along with the chain that would bind her tightly. Hey, is this safe? A father asked worriedly. A trick like this was already entering territory he was not comfortable with. He wouldn't be so worried if it hadn't been proven that the sabers were real. He didn't want his son to see an accident. Don't worry, nothing will happen. I'm sure she will come out at the last minute. They always do that, another responded, playing it down as he watched the woman being put in the box. Don't worry, Daddy, everything will be fine, a small blonde boy said to his father, who only pursed his lips uncertainly. If Will ever saw an accident, his wife would undoubtedly kill him. Not wanting to suffer his mother's wrath, the man pulled his son closer, so that if the worst happened, he could always cover his eyes in time. Just stay close, son. Will murmured, uninterested but still obeying his father. Ads by PubFuture. After locking the padlock and wrapping several chains around the box, the assistants began to play their instruments. Fun yet anxious music filled the arena. As the music played, the assistants with the sabers surrounded the box. The cold metal reflected the light of the lamps that illuminated the arena. The music picked up faster and faster, a sign that time was running out. As the speed accelerated, so did the hearts of those present. Thump, thump, the sound of the drums marked the end, and at the same time, the sabers pierced the box. Screams of horror filled the stands, and parents quickly covered their children's eyes. However, there was only confusion as the assistants did not move from their places or try to help. Instead, they continued to stab the box with their sabers, making sure that no place was left free. Well, that's grim, a familiar female voice sounded from the side, and the audience turned to look in amazement as Miss All-Trick suddenly sat next to the girl from before, holding a deck of cards and showing her some tricks. Luckily, I'm not there anymore. Amused, the woman snapped her fingers, and another flash of light blinded those present as the light went out. It only lasted 5 seconds, but she had disappeared when the lights came back on. I missed the trick, Will cried, looking at his father, who could only try to calm the child whose eyes were piercing his soul and heart. Sorry. Large lights pointed to the center, where a small podium was painted in bright colors with ridiculous animals and figures. A man stood on it. This man was wearing a bright red waistcoat with black buttons, a tall black hat, and white gloves, a simple mask with a smile painted on his face. This man extended his hand to the audience and laughed joyfully amid the applause. Thank you very much for your attention. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow for a new show. And also, don't forget the special collaboration we'll have next Tuesday. An event that rarely happens. A special performance. The Dello Circus and the Gordy Circus will collaborate. You can't miss it. See you soon, and have a good night. The man took off his big hat, placed it on his chest, and bowed elegantly. Boom! A large cloud of purple smoke surrounded him, hiding his figure from the surprised audience. After a moment, the cloud dispersed, and the man in the small podium disappeared. This trick only made the audience scream with excitement. That trick always works. Laughing softly backstage after using the hidden trapdoor, the announcer could only give thanks for such a fun job. Miss All Tricks carriage. A little later, AHRGGG. Lying back in her seat, the woman removed her mask and pulled down her hood. Her blonde hair fell free, and she used a handkerchief to wipe the sweat from her forehead. The face of her new identity, Livia Storm, was revealed. After finishing another series of circus performances, the woman continued her half-hour relaxation before returning home to Zio, who was probably preparing dinner as usual. She was a little embarrassed to notice that this had been the case since they had met. "I need to learn to cook other things than scrambled eggs and tea." Noting that she should get a cookbook, the woman grabbed her tunic and pulled it away from her body, letting a little cool air in. Even with the autumn on us, the heat in the tent is extremely uncomfortable. "I feel like I'm cooking." Grabbing a simple glass and filling it with water from the simple tank in her room, she emptied the contents in one big gulp. She repeated this 3 times until she felt her throat was no longer a desert of salt and bitterness. Returning to her seat, Furs closed her eyes and felt the progress of her potion. Opening her blue wells, which now shone more ethereally, she nodded gently. At its core, a trickmaster will never be anything more than a trickster. Someone willing to use all kinds of tricks to achieve their goals. Whether they are fair or unfair, it doesn't matter. As long as they achieve their goal, the means don't matter. That's the core of a trickmaster. Ads by PubFuture. Furs was sure she had finally found it. Not only was the sense of digestion she felt at the moment of performing the trick greater than her usual tricks of cheating at cards, but also because her spirituality and intuition whispered to her. Sinking into her seat, almost merging with it, the woman just laughed pathetically. She should have realized it the day she helped that lunatic kill Pirate Admiral Kilongos. When she intervened to paralyze the pirate, her potion overreacted momentarily. She didn't realize it because of the emotion of the moment and everything that happened afterward, helping the fight, running away from the churches, and hiding. There was no time to think about it. At that moment, I acted like a true trickster, waiting for the right moment to pull off my trick and rob the winner of his victory. The potion was not digested because I was not acting correctly, not counting how I never revealed myself, and according to Mr. Kenway, an audience's reaction is important for digestion. Furs nodded weakly, her head bouncing senselessly. Missing an opportunity like that didn't bother her. If she had revealed herself, the Nighthawks and the machinery hivemind would have known that there were more Beyonders besides those two, and escape would have been impossible, forcing her to use one of the stones. Even a cheater must know when it is appropriate to use their hand. If a cheater can't even ensure they survive the game, are they really a cheater? Furs felt that this could even apply to the apprentice. The abilities she had gained by advancing to Trickmaster, while they might sound strong, were actually relatively weak. The writer felt that the true function of the skills she had obtained was not to help her in combat but to help her escape. If it's really like that and the apprentice's pathway is focused on escape, I can say I got the best possible path. Furs could say she had no regrets about her path for the first time. What was the point of having strong and extravagant powers if you couldn't save yourself with them? Escaping with your life could even be considered another form of strength. That sounds good. Taking a simple notebook out of her waistcoat, Furs wrote down her recent thoughts, underlining them several times. She could use this idea for a book. Finishing jotting down an initial idea, the book was closed and placed on its side. Even though she had found the Trickmaster's core, that didn't mean she had already won. She had only seen the right path, and she still had to travel it. She had to change many of her performances, as they were more like those of a magician than a trickmaster. Even her trick today was more like that of a magician. She needed to make adjustments. But that's during working hours. Now I'm free. Not wanting to work unpaid overtime, Furs quickly got ready to leave. She changed into her most comfortable clothes, a soft yellow tunic dress bordering on vanilla, her wide-brimmed hat, and a white umbrella. Adjusting her laurel and better arranging her bracelets on her arms, Furs left her room, and calmly made her way home. Passing through the quiet streets of the art district, Fur's mind returned to the announcement made by her boss. Mr. Kenway said that one of the missing members worked in that circus. Maybe I can finally meet him. His name was Nathan, and if I remember correctly, Miss Sasha's partner. What kind of man is capable of dealing with that woman? He must be a real giant, a warrior worthy of the most brutal coliseums. Furs felt nothing but respect for that huge woman, along with perhaps a little fear. It would be stupid not to be nervous of someone whose arm is almost as big as your head, but she couldn't help thinking that the partner of that great woman must be the epitome of a mountain. She was sure that Nathan would be that circus's strong man. Lifting tables full of people on his back and doing push-ups with them, throwing massive rocks over great distances, and with his prodigious size several heads taller than the people around him, he would be easy to see. The writer couldn't help but feel somewhat nervous about meeting such a man. As she considered how to handle her encounter with such a sinister man, a soft melody reached her ears. What a beautiful song! Furs stopped her walk for a moment to listen and look across the street where the music was coming from. Strumming his guitar strings delicately but with emotion, a man was sitting on a folding chair. His eyes were closed, and he had a simple gray hat at his feet that already had some coins. She could feel how the anxiety that had been whipping her up these last few days was cleansed by the dancing of the strings. Closing her eyes for a moment, Furs let the melody wash over her and bathe her. Releasing a silent sigh, the author took a purse from her tunic and, after thinking for a moment, took out 8 cuprum. Waiting for the passing carriages to provide a window, she crossed the street. It was a beautiful melody. Flattering with a small smile, Furs dropped the coins into the hat. Being closer to the man, she could see his features better. He was an older man, perhaps in his 30s or mid-40s. His hair was a dark gray and wrinkles adorned his face. Although he showed his age, the man was still good-looking. Contrary to her expectations, his clothes were not old or damaged. They looked quite well cared for and of good quality, and their vivid green and blue colors were still evident. Not a beggar, a hobby, then, Furs noticed as she straightened up, seeing how she had gained the musician's attention. Looking up and without stopping playing his guitar, the man opened his eyes revealing a soft crimson red. "Thank you, miss." Furs paused for a moment, surprised by the sight. Recovering immediately, the woman gave an elegant curtsy, grasping the edges of her tunic, and said goodbye to the man. "I thought they would be black." The writer looked over her shoulder curiously at the man, who lowered his head again and continued to strum the guitar, filling the street with melody. After a few seconds, she continued on her way at a more leisurely pace, planning to tell her best friend about this curious encounter over dinner. Friday, September 7th, Artiro Street, Warehouse 7, 11:30 a.m. Klein wore darker robes than usual and had added a bit of makeup to change his appearance. He looked at the man in front of him with an emotionless face. Harvey Wayne smiled at the look he was receiving, his eyes sparkling mischievously as he led the detective through the empty warehouse. "Why the long face? I told you we're simply going to a place where we can talk more comfortably. I thought we were going straight to the party." "The party is at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's still a long way off." The man replied with a chuckle. "May I know why you made me come then?" Klein let out a little annoyance, asking a little harder than he meant to. Realizing his mistake, he tried to rectify himself, but the man's amused response stopped him. "Because it's an Aurora Order party, I thought you might like a little time to prepare." "What?" Barely swallowing that shout, the clown looked dazedly at the man who had stopped walking. Quote. After a few seconds in silence, he was the first to break it. "Is that a good idea?" "Of course. Why?" Harvey answered quickly, not even passing a second. His eyes shone a bit more. Quote. Klein had many reasons to not participate in a gathering organized by the Aurora Order. That organization follows an evil god. He already had a confrontation against it. He didn't want to associate with a group of lunatics. But the most important reason why he didn't want to participate is because he technically killed the son of their god. Klein was sure that Chariot knew his true identity. If not for his recognition of him as the blessed of the fool in their first encounter, it would be because the Scarlet Monarch revealed it to him. It was also very likely that he knew the details of what had happened in Tingen. For all that, he was surprised that the man was willing to enter the lion's den. Wouldn't going in there serve me on a silver platter? While he didn't say it, how he looked at him couldn't have been more obvious. Chariot smiled mysteriously and winked mischievously. It may not look like it, but this gathering is one of the safest we can participate in. That said, the man turned and continued to a door at the back of the warehouse, leaving behind a perturbed Klein. Recovering, the man quickly sped toward the door where the man disappeared. What the fuck does that mean? Explain yourself, Chariot. Don't think you can just escape after saying that. Opening it, the man was about to step inside when he froze. I'm going to be jumped. His muscles tensed, and the desire to use the slumber charm in his pocket to escape was immense, but he suppressed it. This is what I get for not asking if it would be just the two of us. Chariot, in his true appearance, was a few meters from the detective. His fiery red hair was tied in a high ponytail, leaving two loose parts to frame his face. The handsome man sat in a simple wooden chair, his legs crossed, his cheek resting on his palm. At his right side stood the same white-haired woman he had seen a few days ago in his office. Her gaze was still disinterested, but Klein could sense that there was a little more attention on them. Finally, a few steps to the side of them were a man and a woman, the latter seated. The woman was blonde and wore dark robes and a curtained hat, barely revealing her face, but he could still sense she was looking at him. Ads by PubFuture. Klein would have thought she was a doll if he had not seen the rise and fall of her chest. The man appeared older, with pale skin and eyes that barely contained malicious intent. The clown would have already thought he wanted to attack him if it weren't for his bored expression. Let me introduce you. Smiling, Adrian pointed to the white-haired woman. The beautiful woman next to me is Flora. You've already met her. Outside, use the name Abigail when addressing her. The one who looks like a doll is Madame Sharon, while the one who looks like a rabid dog is Marich. Don't let those scary eyes deceive you, he is actually a puppy. After introducing the gothic duo, and ignoring the look Marich was giving him, the redhead laughed and winked at the detective. They're all part of my team. Treat them well, yes. Klein looked at the group in front of him, keeping his eyes on each member for no more than 6 seconds. Team of a demigod, none should be below sequence 6. Powerhouses surround me. The man had to fight to not try to swallow. This was the second time such a strong team had surrounded him, the first being when he met the Krestet Sesimir team. If they wanted to, they could kill me without me being able to do anything. Knowing that he could not show weakness in front of such a group, Klein controlled his body and showed no reaction other than a subtle nod. Quote. 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 Why isn't he saying anything? Pursing his lips a little, the clown discreetly glanced at the rest, and to his surprise, the duo on the left was looking at Chariot. For her part, Flora had only one hand clenching her brow in exasperation. Well, Chariot's sudden words snapped him out of his trance, and Klein returned his attention to the smiling man. Excuse me, you have yet to introduce yourself to my group. It is bad manners not to do so when we gladly prepare to receive you. This guy loves to get on my nerves. Feeling like a vein wanted to burst in his brain and give him an aneurysm, Klein could only sigh internally to calm himself. After a few seconds of consideration, he decided to return the coin. I'm Detective Sherlock Moriarty, it's a pleasure. If Chariot was willing to show the trust he had in showing him his true appearance, then Klein knew he couldn't stand by and let him show off alone. Clapping his hands, Adrian jumped up from his seat and walked to his side. With more familiarity than Klein was comfortable with, the redhead draped his arm over his shoulder and pulled him to him. Are you forgetting how big you are? The detective thought, somewhat embarrassed. The difference in height and size between them causing his cheek to collide directly with the man's prominent chest. Klein also noted, somewhat surprised, how soft they were and how nice his body smelled. It's like 2 pillows. Upon realizing what his mind had said, the clown wanted to put another bullet in there. He's a good friend, so take good care of him. With that said, Adrian released the detective from his grip, but not before patting him on the back. Chariot is a lot more playful than I thought. Somewhat out of sorts, Klein adjusted his laurel and looked flatly at the rest, noting how the white-haired woman was looking directly at him. Well, with introductions made, why don't we discuss how we'll attend the gathering? Laughing a little, the red-haired man raised his voice a little. While it will be safe enough, the last thing we want is to draw attention to ourselves. That will only cause problems. So our priority will be to be as common as possible. It would be best if we went in separate groups instead of together. That way, we can gather ingredients and materials without attracting too much attention. Adrian laughed softly as he looked at Klein. Sure, you'll give us the money for the ingredients you want. Ads by PubFuture. Since we are in the same place, we won't charge any fees. Aren't I very good? Is there a specific material you're looking for? Klein nodded internally in agreement with the man's words. Earlier, he was worried that gathering the magician's ingredients might attract the attention of the Secret Order and even the Aurora Order. To avoid that, he had planned to gather materials at various Beyonder gatherings, but his worries seemed misplaced. He was about to mention the same idea as Chariot but didn't know how to do so comfortably. Having smart partners is the best thing. You don't have to worry about always being the brains when the guy next to you can think. Klein sighed internally in relief but couldn't help but look at the redhead with suspicion. While he said he wouldn't charge a fee, he didn't say he wouldn't ask for anything in return. With this guy, you must always read between the lines. With that in mind, the clown wasted no time making his request. I'm searching for the true root of a mist treant and all the spinal fluid of a dark-patterned black panther. Pick one, I'll take the other. Adrian nodded and, after a moment's thought, said, I'll take the root. He then turned to his group. You guys aren't looking for anything for us to keep an eye open for. Just some ingredients for talismans and rituals. We can get those ourselves. Sharon replied in a serene voice. They did not need materials at the moment, they were only attending this gathering to fulfill their leader's mission and obtain a possible network of resources. One could say it's more of an exploration on their part. Adrian heard that and quickly responded, noting the opportunity he had there. If you're going for ingredients, then pick this up for me. At least 50 milliliters of the blood of the blind goat, try to get more of it along with your materials. Also, 20 grams of white stag hair. And at least 4 claws of the white raven. Considering the party it is, they should be easy to obtain. Understood. Saren nodded slightly, almost ignoringly. Seeing that the last ingredients he needed for Serena were dealt with. Adrian made another request. I want Charlotte to read that book you obtained. Can I borrow it for him to use? When they completed the first floor of the tower and the woman obtained the talisman-making book, Adrian immediately thought of Charlotte. Of course, he couldn't just take something from Sharon without more. While they were on the same team, who would like it if they just grabbed your stuff and gave it to someone else without your permission? The most logical way to deal with this was, clearly, to ask for it like any good child. He also waited at least a week before asking for it. This would increase the odds of him borrowing it since by that point, it was very certain that the doll had already read it in its entirety. Sharon didn't rush her response, she just closed her eyes and seemed to fall asleep. We will lend the book. But in return, the first 10 talismans he makes will be ours. Reasonable. The price was much cheaper than he thought, but the red-haired man didn't think anything of it. Is she really not a doll? Klein didn't know whether to believe Chariot that the one standing in front of him was a human being and not a doll. Nodding softly, Adrian turned his attention to his companion, who shook her head, something that didn't surprise him. Next Sunday was the Hermits of Fate meeting, where there were sure to be things she was more interested in obtaining. Of course, where she would also have more authority. After all, she is one of the only 3 demigods in the Jacob family. Praising his companion's thriftiness, Adrian couldn't help but frown a little at that. Flora had been missing for several years without showing any signs of life. What would her family's aptitude towards her be like? Flora may be suppressed, but in theory, she's still a demigod. No self-respecting ancient family, let alone one in as bad a state as Jacob's, would close the door on her. Adrian was sure they would have their suspicions and conduct their tests, but he wasn't worried about that. He would deal with it. Seeing that no one else was saying anything, the distribution of the groups was quickly made. According to Marich and Sharon, going alone would draw some attention, so a partner was necessary. For obvious reasons, Adrian and Klein would be in different groups. There would be no point in different people buying the ingredients when they were in the same group. Adrian and Flora will be the first group to enter the gathering, followed by Marich, Sharon, and Klein 10 minutes later. With the order ready and after changing his appearance again with creeping hunger, the group of 5 left Warehouse 7 in the direction of the gathering. The Aurora Order's gathering was in the Nexus district, which was an hour's walk from the Artelia district. 2 private carriages were hired to make the trip in 30 minutes. Adrian paid 15 argentum for the 2 carriages, but they didn't leave at the same time. One would go now, which he and Flora would get on, while the other would pick up the trio in another street in 20 minutes, with the explicit instruction not to see them. With Flora sitting in front of him, wearing a dark hooded robe that concealed her white hair, Adrian, who had changed his appearance to a simple blonde man with deep eyes, finally considered it a good time to close his eyes and breathe a little. This is one of the few gatherings I can attend without having 50 eyes on my back, and the only one where I can afford to go with Klein. Not having his spy bird checking the area and telling him what he saw really got on his nerves. The sooner that rat dies, the better. He hadn't lied to Klein when he said that the Aurora Order gathering was one of the safest they could attend, but he may have understated it when he said it. The reason was simple. It was the only gathering where it was impossible for them to meet the useless writer and the 3-flavored soup that used him as a pot. Medici is a believer of the Rapper and seeks to obtain his help, but all his attempts are thwarted by Einhorn and Sauron, who won't let him. If they disagree on a decision, it will cause internal conflict, and they won't be able to do anything. They are inside the body of the useless writer, which means that he also does not interact with anything related to the Rapper, including the parties organized by the Aurora Order. Adrian knew he had to move carefully and calculate every step. The slightest mistake would lead to disasters he couldn't handle now. While he was lost in thought, Flora turned her attention from the window to him. "What sequence is the detective?" The white-haired woman whispered so softly that a normal person wouldn't have heard her, but the conspirator's ear picked her up easily. Blinking slightly, the blonde man raised an eyebrow as he replied without saying anything else. His lips moved. "Sequence 8 clown. The ingredients he ordered are for his promotion to magician, so it will soon be sequence 7. Why?" Flora calmly shook her head as she turned her attention back to the window, a small smile on her face. "No reason. Quote. Silently, Adrian stared at his partner for 20 seconds. Having some idea of what the woman might be thinking at that moment, thanks to his not-so-proud readings of particular novels, the man couldn't help but stare at her in a daze. On the other hand, the woman seemed to focus even more on what was happening outside, even though the curtain was almost completely closed, and nearly nothing could be seen. Finally, Adrian broke the silence, speaking in his normal tone but with a hint of disbelief. "You know I don't like men, right? You don't have to be jealous." Ignoring how hot her ears felt, Flora looked a little deeper into the window. Quote. Shut up, princess. Nodding with his lips slightly raised, Adrian couldn't help but think about how Klein would be doing with Sharon and Marich. Their first meeting could be considered quite interesting. In the second carriage, "What is your relationship with our boss?" Sharon asked, her voice a cold iceberg that seemed to freeze the spirit of her victim. Is this an interrogation? Klein couldn't help himself and swallowed some saliva. The heat he felt was already being missed because of the cold that replaced it. He couldn't understand what he had done to deserve such treatment. Rummaging quickly in his memory for a long-for answer, the only moment that reared its head in the haze was when Chariot hugged him. But why? It didn't make sense. Single quote. Realization struck the detective, whose insides were quickly filled with horror. Does she think we're anything more than just friends? Don't tell me Madame Sharon is one of those BL fans who I was warned so much about not to get involved with. The scene in the warehouse room would be the dream of every fan of that toxic genre, and Klein could only tremble at the implications. He didn't like men. Klein controlled his body like a puppet, putting on his most serious, categorical, uncompromising face, conjuring up all his clown powers. We're just friends. The woman in the dark robes did not blink. Her icy eyes looked deeply at him for several seconds in silence. Quote. Klein could only return the gaze as best he could without blinking. After over 30 seconds, Sharon slowly closed her eyes and sank into her seat, an almost supernatural movement. That's good. Did I pass the test? Barely containing his sigh of relief, the corners of the detective's lips trembled uncomfortably. Marich, who saw the whole exchange, sighed slightly before addressing the detective. Please, Mr. Moriarty, don't take it personally. She loves romance novels and, to quote the Emperor Russell, she has already shipped Mr. and Mrs. Flora. He said, emphasizing with his fingers in a flat expression. With his mouth open and not knowing what to say, the clown looked at the spectral woman. His image of her was utterly fragmented. Before, she was a cold woman whose gaze could freeze even the air and whose doll-like appearance made her look more like a knife. Now, he couldn't see her as anything other than a woman in gothic clothes sitting in a library reading a book with a pink cover and hearts with an exaggeratedly intense gaze. His mouth was still hanging open, and failing to close, Klein felt he had entered the workshop of the ridiculous. Is it a requirement that the team of a demigod has such eccentric members? Nexus District, Martyr Street, half an hour later, 12:40. Taking a seat at one of the many tables, Adrian looked around the gathering place. It's not that different from Backland. It seems that the Aurora Order has a strict plan to follow. Raising an eyebrow, the man nodded in agreement. Organizing a different table arrangement for each gathering you control would undoubtedly become tiresome, so he wasn't surprised to see a little repetition. His eyes didn't move far from the table, but out of the corner of his eye, he observed all the participants who had come here. Some dressed in costumes as heavy as his and Flora's, with thick robes and masks, while others wore simpler costumes. Others wore nothing, their faces uncovered. Ads by PubFuture. Adrian was sure it was either Faceleys or some artifact of the same kind. Of course, they could also be bold enough to be their true appearances. Sometimes the most effective disguise is none at all. His eyes bored to the large blackboard at the side, and he couldn't help but snort inwardly. All information related to Adrian Kenway. 8,000 Sassam. Room 12. At least they pay well. Maybe I should give some details about myself and take the money for myself. Raising an eyebrow, the man decided to note this idea for later. Don't even think about it. The harsh whisper of his partner made the conspirator roll his eyes. You're no fun. Sighing, he looked bored at the board and the information on it. He had already written his request on a sheet of paper and handed it to one of the facilitators, who had already written it on one of the many boards on the wall. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for them to call his name and give him a room. Although his attention was not focused on the podium at the back of the room, it was almost impossible for him to ignore its great emotion. Seated on an elegant chair with crimson cushions, what appeared to be a woman in a black hooded robe obscuring half of her face rested her cheek against his knuckles. Although her robe hid her figure, one could still see how well sculpted she was. The delicate chin and thick red lips that could be seen from under the hood's darkness gave a hint of the beauty hidden beneath it, and the very shadows seemed to invite someone to try to explore them to devour them. From what he had heard in the conversations around him and the information obtained by Miss Casper, her name was Miss L. She had been leading this gathering for the last 10 years. It seems that it is a requirement to be beautiful to be part of the Aurora Order. So far, there has never been any record of anyone being ugly there. The blonde man did not know how to take this information. Although beauty was evident, what stood out most about the woman was undoubtedly the joy and happiness that seemed to emanate from her. Since he had arrived, she had been singing softly. They are definitely a team of lunatics. They don't even try to hide that they've achieved something. Applauding and criticizing such an action, the redhead whistled in respect. Anyone who looked at her would immediately know that the Aurora Order had achieved something. Those without inside information would never know what it was. I bet some of the people sitting here are a team of wise owls, monitoring and watching the movements of the organization. It would be idiotic if, after what he revealed, the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom did not treat the threat with the seriousness it deserved. And if they really were wise ones, they would let the Aurora continue with gatherings. That way, they could easily control them. It would be a colossal mistake to dismantle them and make them move in the shadows. It is much easier to prepare for the danger you see. You have to worry about the hidden snake in the hole. With that final thought, Adrian closed his eyes and decided to rest until the gathering began. Ding ding. With the ringing of the bell, the gathering officially began. Soon, there was movement. The facilitators began shouting the ingredients on the boards for everyone to hear. Once they had said them 3 times, they moved on to the next one. After a while, one of the workers approached him and handed him a small note. He took it and opened it and saw only 2 words in Hermes. Room 19. Knowing what this was like, he got up from his seat and followed the worker, waving goodbye to Flora with a simple hand gesture. Arriving at the numbered room and entering it alone, he noticed that it was similar to the rooms in Backland but slightly different. 2 sofas where one could sit if one liked, a small table and in the corner a shelf full of books. A figure, also covered by a thick robe, was sitting on one of the sofas. From what he could discern, it was a man. He was elegantly seated, his back straight, and his head held high. Adrian's brow furrowed gently under his mask. His nose detected a familiar coppery scent. Blood. Following that, he immediately noticed that he couldn't smell the man on the sofa. He had no scent. A vampire or a faceless? Neither sounds right. Of course, it could also be a potion. With a thought, the threads that covered his body like armor increased in number and hardness. His fire ready to be summoned if the situation called for it. Hiding his mistrust behind a calmer, expressionless face, he asked, the teeth of the forest hunter or the true root of a mistreant? True root of a mistreant? The man's surprisingly delicate voice unsettled the conspirator somewhat. Ignoring the previous episode, Adrian nodded. No faceless. Vampire then, nobody who could control their voice would choose that one. Boredly, he went to the sofa opposite the man and sat down, crossing his legs, his foot moving without interest. How much for it? As he spoke, some threads came loose from the invisible armor covering his support foot. The threads slipped under the wooden floor and carefully and calmly moved toward the man before him. It's a difficult material to obtain even for someone like me, so 1900 sasam seems more than fair to me. Blinking a little, the man tried to continue as if nothing had happened. Adrian's foot paused like his threads. Under his mask, his eyebrow rose a little higher. Nodding slightly, he reached into his tunic, pulled out a thick wad of 100 sasam yellow bills, and began to count with boredom. It wasn't his money, there was no need to haggle over the price. The possible vampire in front of him stared at him open-mouthed. Ignoring the look he was receiving, Adrian took out 1900 sasam and handed it to the man, who took it somewhat tensely. Although his tunic covered his face, his regret at not asking for more money was as clear as the summer sky. Adrian did not care about the man's emotions. He held out his hand. The root. Ah, of course, forgive me. Adjusting his posture, the man carefully reached into his tunic, pulled a metal container, and extended it to him. Adrian took it and opened it, confirming that the object was what he had paid for. Adrian closed the container and reapplied the wall of spirituality around it. Without saying anything else, he calmly got up from his seat. It was a pleasure doing business with you. Wait, you're looking for the teeth of the forest hunter, right? The man's desperate voice stopped him, and Adrian became increasingly confused. Ads by PubFuture. Do you have them? And no, but if I checked my warehouse, I probably would have them. Seeing that he was almost gone, the man quickly added. Probably is not a yes. Clutching his head, Adrian growled slightly in frustration. I assure you, sir. My warehouse is top quality. A material like that is sure to be there. It's just that I don't always check the list of what's there, so I'd have to go and see. But it would only take a short while. I can deliver it to you tonight. I just need time. Are you that desperate for money? Sensing that he had seen the truth of what the man was looking for, Adrian just growled and nodded with clear frustration. Let's do this. I'll take your deal if I don't get the teeth at this gathering. But only if I don't get them. 10 minutes before the gathering ends, I will post an announcement that I am looking for 18 pages of Emperor Russell's notebook. If you see that announcement, it means I accept. Just take the option and take a room. With that, he shrugged. I don't need to mention what it would mean if it's not on the board, do I? You won't regret it, the man said with a big smile, white teeth shining. Adrian didn't smile back or say anything. He just looked at the man's larger-than-normal fangs, nodded, and left. Walking down the hall, he held out his hand and boredly scratched his chest. To normal eyes, it seemed like a simple movement, nothing special. But to certain unique eyes like his, a transparent and almost invisible thread was put into a vial, and the curious crimson tip it had was cut while another with a few hairs was hidden. If you're not careful of your surroundings, having a little blood and a few hairs stolen is too easy. You shake the target a little, and they won't know what happened. Taking the poor guy he had tricked as an example, Adrian decided he would be more alert from now on. Shaking his head and hiding the vial in his tunic, he quickly returned to Flora. The part of the tree ranch, which was his request, was deleted from the board, but the teeth one remained. Now that Klein's part was completed, he could focus on the little son commission. So, he took a piece of paper and a pen and wrote his request. He gave it to a facilitator and soon saw it on the blackboard. I need a powerful artifact with decent destructive powers, maximum to sequence 7. 30 minutes later, a worker approached him and gave him a note. Room 12. As he was getting up, Adrian wasn't surprised by this development. This was a gathering of high quality, and an artifact of sequence 7 was sure to be here. Tapping the briefcase at his side, the blonde nodded. Hope you like it, little son, I promise this one won't break. This thing cost him over 6,000 sasam, so son better take care of it. As the participants arrived and left, Adrian noticed how a facilitator had just finished writing a request. I'm looking for all the dark patterned Black Panther's spinal fluid. Price to be negotiated. Well, welcome to your first gathering of lunatics, Klein. Get used to it because it won't be the last. Laughing softly, he could only feel sorry for the man and himself. After a while, one of the facilitators approached him and handed him a note. It's from Miss L. Her words caught Flora's attention, and she glanced at the woman on the podium, who was still singing. She was highly pleased. They were taking their time. Raising an eyebrow, Adrian took the letter with boredom. Since the true creator had placed an investment in him, it was obvious that, in a way, that guy was watching him. At first, he thought it was because of the burnt band, but it seems that was not the case. The rapper marked me in a different way than I thought. Shaking his head, Adrian opened the letter, and the contents made him press his lips together uncomfortably. The Lord greets you, Adrian Kenway. Please enjoy my humble party and tell me anything you desire. I will give my all to make it happen. Foo-foo, the giggle drew his attention back to Miss L, who looked even happier than before. The dark woman raised a hand and waved innocently. Then, with much more enthusiasm, she continued humming. La la, la la la. Immediately after that, all the participants' attention fell on him. Some were more obvious, while others just looked sideways, but he could still feel the stares on him. Seeing all the attention they had gained, Flora moved a little closer to Adrian, who closed the letter again. What does it say? Annoying things. With a click of his tongue, Adrian did not elaborate and placed the letter on the candle on his table, letting the fire consume it. A movement identical to that of a lady burning the love letter of an annoying suitor. Such an action did not bother Miss L at all, who continued humming. Lunatics, no doubt. Half an hour had passed since that strange and disturbing moment when a worker approached him with a letter. Reading the room number, this time it was Flora who went. Watching his partner leave, Adrian just shook his head. Better luck next time, Mr. Vampire. When he saw his teeth, any doubt about his path was resolved, a sequence 7 vampire. Such desperation for money had undoubtedly left him confused and disoriented. Guided by his words in the supposed warehouse, he should be doing well financially, so perhaps he was looking for something else. A formula or an artifact. The only ones who controlled that pathway were the Rose School of Thought, the Life School of Thought, the Church of the Earth Mother, and the Sanguine. Of these organizations, 3 could be considered good, while 1 was a plague to be exterminated. Therefore, Adrian considered it worthwhile to investigate this individual, so he used his threads to obtain some of his blood and hair. Shaking his head slightly, the blond man decided to wait for his partner to return. 30 minutes later, rising gracefully from her seat, Miss L smiled at everyone present. That's as far as we go. Dear Fanfic audiobook community, I hope you're all enjoying the journey through Lord of Mysteries Fire of Destruction as much as I am. I wanted to share an important update regarding our upload schedule for Low TM Fire of Destruction. Starting now, I'll be posting new videos of Low TM Fire of Destruction every 5 days, each covering 10 chapters of the novel. This change aligns with the author The Witness's current release pace of 2 chapters daily, with the latest chapter being chapter 403. If you're eager to read the newest chapters as soon as they're available, I encourage you to visit the author's official platform. Web links. Thank you for your continued support and understanding. Let's continue to enjoy various novels and fanfiction together. Best regards, Fanfic Audiobook.